Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a glittering Victorian ballroom where the rustle of silk mingles with whispered secrets, and one wrong movement of your wrist could destroy your reputation forever. You stand at the edge of the dance floor, a delicate painted fan clutched in your gloved hand, and you feel the weight of 100 watchful eyes. The orchestra swells. Candlelight flickers across gilt mirrors, and you absolutely know that if you raise that fan with your left hand instead of your right, you might as well announce to everyone present that you're morally defective, possibly possessed, and certainly unmarriageable. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your great-grandmother's portrait shows her awkwardly holding everything in her right hand, despite the unnatural angle of her wrist. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're tucked into bed in Melbourne or winding down after work in Manchester. Maybe you've noticed something odd in old family photographs, hands positioned strangely, people looking uncomfortable holding teacups or pens. Drop a comment about it. I'd love to hear your observations. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in your bedroom on the Tuesday morning in 1873, and your governess, Miss Hartley, has just slapped the back of your left hand with a wooden ruler for the third time this hour. You're 8 years old, and you keep forgetting. The fan, that beautiful ivory and lace creation your mother gave you for your birthday, feels natural in your left hand, the way a bird knows which direction to fly. But natural, Miss Hartley reminds you with another sharp crack against your knuckles, is not the same as proper. The sting brings tears to your eyes, but you don't cry. Young ladies of quality don't cry over discipline. And besides, your mother endured far worse when she was your age. The Victorian obsession with right-handedness wasn't merely about preference or convenience. It was a moral imperative woven into the very fabric of respectable society. And nowhere was this more rigidly enforced than in the seemingly frivolous world of fan etiquette. You see, a fan in the 19th century wasn't just a tool for cooling yourself on warm evenings, though the drawing rooms could get suffocatingly hot with all those bodies pressed together. The gas lamps burning, the windows shut tight to keep out the improper London air. No, a fan was a language unto itself, a complex system of silent communication that allowed women to express thoughts they could never speak aloud. And like any language, it had grammar, syntax, and rules that could not be violated. The left hand, throughout Victorian society, carried connotations that ran far deeper than simple practicality. You grow up hearing the words whispered, sometimes shouted, sinister, gauche, cack-handed. Even the etymology betrays the bias. Sinister literally means left in Latin, while dexterous comes from dexter, meaning right. The language itself has been rigged against you since ancient Rome. Your governess explains this while binding your left hand behind your back with a silk scarf, forcing you to practice your fan movements for hours until your right shoulder aches and your fingers cramp into claws. Historians still argue whether the intensity of left-hand correction in the Victorian era represented a peak in this prejudice or merely a more documented continuation of centuries-old bias. What's certain is that the 19th century, with its obsession with classification, moral order, and visible respectability, turned handedness into a matter of public performance. You couldn't simply be left-handed in private and right-handed in public. The training had to be so thorough, so complete, that your body would automatically, unconsciously, Choose the correct hand even in moments of surprise or distraction. Consider the physics of it for a moment. A fan weighs almost nothing, 4 ounces at most, often less. The delicate sticks of ivory or mother of pearl, the painted silk or paper leaf, the tiny rivet holding it all together. You'd think something so light would be easy to manipulate with either hand. But watch a Victorian lady perform even the simplest fan gesture, the gentle flutter to indicate mild interest, the snap shut to signal displeasure, and you realise you're watching the result of thousands of hours of practice. The movement must be smooth, economical, graceful. The fan must appear to float rather than be manipulated. And all of this must be accomplished with the right hand, leaving the left to rest demurely in your lap or hold your dance card or gesture minimally to emphasise a point in conversation. Your mother tells you stories in hushed tones when Miss Hartley isn't listening. She speaks of her cousin Margaret, who was naturally left-handed and refused to be corrected. Margaret used her fan with whichever hand felt comfortable, alternating unconsciously as the evening wore on. At her debut ball, the most important night of a young woman's life, Margaret was so nervous she forgot her training entirely. She fanned herself with her left hand while speaking to a potential suitor, the eldest son of a viscount. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men were trained to notice these things just as carefully as women were trained to perform them. He made his excuses and never called on her again. Margaret eventually married a country doctor, a kind man by all accounts, but she never entered London society again. The whisper followed her left-handed, and therefore somehow wrong. The cruelty of it strikes you now, lying in your bed in the 21st century, trying to imagine the suffocation of it all. But in 1873 you don't question it any more than you question why the sky is blue, or why you must wear a corset even though you're only 8 years old. This is simply how the world works. The left hand is wrong, the right hand is correct, and a fan must only ever be wielded by the proper hand or you risk everything. You practice in front of your mirror for an hour each day, watching your reflection perform the movements. Open the fan slowly with a flick of the right wrist. This means wait for me. Snap it shut quickly. I'm angry with you. Touch it to your right cheek. Yes. Touch it to your left cheek. No. Draw it across your eyes. I'm sorry. Let it rest on your right ear. You've changed. Every gesture has meaning. Every movement is a word. And every word must be spoken with the correct hand, or the entire sentence becomes gibberish. Or worse, an insult you didn't intend. The weight of expectation presses down on your chest like a physical thing. You're not just learning to use a fan. You're learning to be the right kind of woman, the acceptable kind. The kind who will make a good match and bring honour to her family and never, ever embarrass herself by revealing that underneath all this training, all this correction, all these hours of practice, you might just be naturally, irrevocably, dangerously left-handed. You're 16 now, standing in the Ashfords' ballroom with 36 other young women, and you're learning that a fan is more powerful than any words you'll ever be allowed to speak in public. The dancing master. Monsieur Beaumont, though everyone knows he's actually Bernard Cooper from Cheapside, demonstrates a gesture so subtle you almost miss it. He holds the fan vertically against his lips with his right hand, fingers positioned just so on the ivory sticks. This, mademoiselles, means kiss me, he announces in his affected French accent, and the room erupts in nervous giggles. Your best friend Caroline goes crimson. You practice the movement yourself, watching in the mirror as your right hand lifts the fan, positions it, holds it. The gesture feels absurd, too bold, too scandalous. But this is the language you must master. The Victorian language of fans developed over decades into something far more complex than simple cooling devices or decorative accessories. By the 1870s, an entire vocabulary had crystallized, passed from mother to daughter, taught in finishing schools, published in ladies' magazines with helpful diagrams. You collect these magazines, cutting out the illustrations and pasting them into a leather-bound notebook your father gave you. Page after page of delicate hands performing precise movements, each one labelled with its meaning. Drawing the fan across your forehead means you have changed. Carrying it in your left hand, here's where it gets interesting, theoretically means desirous of acquaintance. But you've been warned never to attempt this gesture because the left hand itself negates any proper meaning. It's like trying to speak French with an accent so thick nobody can understand you. The message becomes garbled, suspect, potentially offensive. The complexity rivals any spoken language. And historians still argue whether these fan codes were truly universal or if different regions and social circles developed their own dialects. What's documented in ladies' magazines from London might not match the customs practiced in Bath or Edinburgh. Some scholars suggest the whole system was more aspirational than real, something women read about and attempted to follow but which remained too complicated for everyday use. Others point to diaries and letters where women explicitly reference fan communications they witnessed or performed. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. The language existed, certainly, but whether everyone spoke it fluently or merely pretended to understand it remains an open question. You watch your mother at a charity ball one evening, observing her with new eyes now that you understand what you're seeing. She's speaking with Lady Pemberton about the church roof fund, and her fan moves constantly, not the frantic fluttering of a nervous woman, but deliberate, measured movements. She touches the fan to her lips while discussing the vicar's wife. She lets it rest against her right cheek while Lady Pemberton speaks. She opens it slowly, closes it slowly, uses it to gesture toward the refreshment table. You're not entirely certain what conversation is happening beneath the spoken one, but you recognize that something is being said, negotiated, understood. Your mother catches your eye across the room and gives you the smallest nod. She knows you're watching. She wants you to watch. This is how you'll learn the subtle dance. Not from Monsieur Beaumont's lessons, but from observation. From years of attending events and decoding the movements of women who've mastered the art. The mechanics of fan language required extraordinary dexterity and muscle memory. Consider that you're often performing these gestures while simultaneously dancing, conversing, managing your skirts, and maintaining perfect posture. Your right hand must remember dozens of distinct positions and movements, each one slightly different from the last, each one carrying a specific meaning. Open the fan wide and hold it over your heart. You have won my love. Open it partially and hold it in front of your face. We are being watched. Twirl it in your right hand, I love another. Twirl it in your left hand well. Nobody teaches you what that means because you should never, ever twirl it in your left hand. The left hand is for holding your reticule, or resting on a gentleman's arm, or occasionally making small supplementary gestures while the right hand does the real communication work with the fan. You develop calluses on your right thumb and forefinger from the hours of practice. The ivory sticks of your best fan wear smooth where you grip them. The painted silk leaf shows creases along its favourite folding lines. Your right wrist becomes remarkably strong and flexible, capable of the tiniest adjustments in angle and position. Your left hand, meanwhile, grows weaker from disuse. You catch yourself sometimes reaching for things with your left hand, a teacup, a book, a hairbrush, and having to consciously correct yourself. Miss Hartley's training worked. Perhaps too well. You're becoming the asymmetrical creature Victorian society demands, overdeveloped on the right, deliberately weakened on the left. The comedy of it hits you sometimes. usually late at night when you can't sleep and your mind wanders to forbidden thoughts. Somewhere in England right now, you think, there's probably another girl lying awake, naturally right-handed, being forced to use her left hand for everything because her family believes it builds character, or because her governess is insane, or because of some quirk of local custom you'll never understand. Maybe you could trade places. Maybe you could each live as yourselves. But no, that's silly. The whole society has organised itself around this arbitrary rule. And one girl's discomfort or 1,000 girls' discomfort won't change it. Carolyn tells you a scandalous story one afternoon while you're taking tea in her family's conservatory. Her older sister Elizabeth, who married a military officer and moved to India, has written about the fan customs she's observed among British colonials in Calcutta. Apparently, in the sweltering heat, women have become more relaxed about fan etiquette. Some even Caroline lowers her voice to barely a whisper, use their fans with both hands, alternating to rest their wrists. Elizabeth writes that the heat makes such rigidity impossible, that adhering strictly to right-hand-only fan use would result in repetitive strain injuries, that the entire British community there has adapted to a more practical approach. Caroline watches your face carefully as she shares this information, knowing what it means to you. For a moment, you feel a wild surge of hope. Perhaps society is changing. Perhaps the rules are loosening. Perhaps by the time you're Elizabeth's age, things will be different. But then Carolyn's mother sweeps into the conservatory, and you both immediately straighten your postures, adjust your hands to proper positions, and adopt the pleasant but vacant expressions expected of young ladies at tea. The moment of possibility vanishes. You're not in Calcutta. You're in London, where the rules remain rigid and the consequences for breaking them remain severe. The psychological impact of this training is something modern doctors and researchers find fascinating. You're essentially being taught to mistrust your own instincts, to override your body's natural impulses, to perform a version of yourself that feels fundamentally false. Some girls adapt easily, the naturally right-handed ones, of course, but also some left-handed girls who seem to possess unusual flexibility, or who simply care less about the internal sense of wrongness. But others struggle for years, decades, their entire lives. You've heard of women who, in the privacy of their own homes, after their husbands have died and society no longer watches them so closely, finally allow themselves to pick up a fan with their left hand to feel the rightness of it, and who weep with something like grief for all the years they denied themselves this small comfort. Monsieur Beaumont Bernard Cooper finishes the day's lesson with a flourish, demonstrating a complex sequence of movements that tells an entire story. I am interested in you, but we are being watched, so meet me by the garden door in 10 minutes. His right hand executes the movements flawlessly. 20 young women attempt to memorize the sequence, their right hands flickering through the gestures like a flock of birds performing murmurations. You wonder if Bernard Cooper is naturally right-handed, or if he, too, had to learn this, had to train himself, had to become the kind of person who could teach young ladies how to communicate without speaking. You wonder if he ever resents it, this absurd dedication to something so arbitrary. But you don't ask. Young ladies don't ask such impertinent questions. Young ladies just practice their fan work until their wrists ache and pray they'll remember the right gestures when the moment comes. You're at your first real ball now. Not a practice session or a small family gathering, but an actual society event with 200 guests and an orchestra from Vienna and ice sculptures melting slowly on tables laden with hothouse fruit. Your right hand trembles slightly as you hold your fan, the beautiful one with painted roses and mother-of-pearl sticks that your grandmother gave you. The same fan she carried at her debut 50 years ago. The weight of history presses against your palm. Your mother stands 3 feet away, watching you with an expression you can't quite read. Pride, perhaps, mixed with anxiety. She knows what you're feeling. She stood exactly where you're standing in 1849 holding this same fan, her own right hand trembling just like yours. The supremacy of right-hand fan etiquette wasn't arbitrary in the way you might think it was deeply, intricately connected to every other aspect of Victorian social performance. Consider how a lady was expected to move through space, gliding rather than walking, her skirt swaying in a perfect bell shape, her spine absolutely straight, her shoulders back but not thrust forward, her head tilted at precisely the correct angle to appear attentive but not forward. Now, add to this physical performance the management of a fan. The right hand holds the fan because the right hand is also the hand you extend to a gentleman, the hand you use to accept a glass of champagne, the hand that rests gracefully on a stair railing as you descend. Everything in a lady's physical vocabulary flows through the right side of her body, and the fan must integrate seamlessly into this choreography. Your dance card dangles from your left wrist on a silk cord, a tiny pencil attached. Gentlemen will approach throughout the evening to request dances, writing their names in the appropriate slots. Meanwhile, your right hand performs its fan work acknowledging greetings, sending signals, managing temperature, and making all those tiny gestures that communicate your thoughts without the vulgarity of actual speech. If you were to hold the fan in your left hand, you'd have to reach across your body to accept a gentleman's hand, creating an awkward cross-body posture that disrupts the entire visual line Victorian aesthetics demanded. The right hand isn't just correct in a moral sense, it's correct in a geometric sense, a practical sense, an artistic sense. Or so the argument goes. You sometimes wonder if the explanations were invented after the rule. Justifications for a prejudice that needed no justification beyond, "We've always done it this way." The disaster scenarios are explained to you in excruciating detail during your final preparation sessions. If you raise the fan with your left hand even once, even for a moment, even if you correct yourself immediately, people will notice. Lady Ashford will notice from across the ballroom. She has eyes like a hawk and a memory for social infractions that spans decades. The Honourable Mr. Fitzwilliam will notice, and he's the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, and he'll mentally cross you off his list of potential wives. The other debutantes will notice and will mention it to their mothers, who will mention it to their friends, who will mention it at their next tea party, and within a week your reputation will carry a small but permanent stain. The Hartwell girl. Oh yes, quite pretty, I suppose, but didn't you hear she used her left hand at the Pemberton ball? One wonders what other rules she might be careless about. Historians still argue whether young women actually experienced this level of scrutiny, or whether the threat of it was exaggerated to ensure compliance. Certainly, some infractions were overlooked: a stumble on the dance floor, a nervous giggle, a wine glass tipped slightly but caught before it spilled. Society could be forgiving of honest mistakes made by nervous debutantes. But hand preference carried different weight because it was seen not as a momentary error but as a revelation of character, a glimpse of the undisciplined self lurking beneath the proper facade. A girl who couldn't remember which hand to use for her fan might also be a girl who couldn't be trusted with household accounts, or who might speak too freely to servants, or who might harbour other dangerous nonconformist tendencies. You practice your breathing, keeping it shallow and controlled despite the corset squeezing your ribs. A young man approaches Thomas Weatherby, the second son of a baron, pleasant-looking if somewhat dim. He bows. You curtsy. He requests the third waltz. You consult your dance card, pretending to consider though you know it's empty, and then nod graciously. He writes his name. During this entire interaction, Your fan remains in your right hand, closed but ready, positioned at your waist in the neutral waiting position. You execute it perfectly. Your mother's expression relaxes slightly. One successful interaction, only several dozen more to survive tonight. The mechanics of right-handed fan supremacy extended beyond the ballroom into every social situation where ladies gathered. At morning calls, your fan rests in your right hand, available for the subtle gestures that supplement conversation. At the theatre, it occupies your right hand, ready to shield your face if an inappropriate scene appears on stage and ready to signal your reaction to companions without the vulgarity of whispering during a performance. At outdoor events, garden parties, lawn tennis parties, archery exhibitions, the fan in your right hand serves as both accessory and communication device. Even in your own drawing room, receiving guests, you maintain the right hand position. The training must be so complete that it becomes unconscious, automatic, as natural as breathing. But here's what nobody tells you until you're living it. Maintaining this rigid control is exhausting. Your right shoulder develops a persistent ache from holding the same position for hours. Your right hand cramps. You develop a twitch in your right eye from the constant vigilance. The endless monitoring of every tiny movement. At home, after balls and parties, you massage your right hand, work the stiffness from your fingers, and feel the deep ache in muscles you didn't know existed. Your left hand, meanwhile, feels almost atrophied, weak and useless. You're becoming lopsided, physically and perhaps mentally. The asymmetry disturbs you in ways you can't quite articulate. The gentlemen at this ball have their own training, their own rules, though you suspect and sometimes quietly resent that their restrictions are less physically demanding. They must bow at the correct angle, speak with appropriate formality, dance with precision, and observe all the complex rules of precedence and propriety. But they don't have to maintain constant communication through a handheld prop. They don't have to remember that touching their hat brim means something different from tipping their hat, means something different from removing their hat entirely. Their social language is simpler, more direct, more forgiving of errors. Or perhaps you're being unfair. Perhaps their burden's equally heavy but differently distributed. You'll never know. The worlds of men and women remain mostly separate, even when they're dancing together in the same ballroom. A gentleman you don't recognize approaches, older than the others, perhaps 30. Distinguished looking, he introduces himself Lord Carrington, recently returned from diplomatic service in Vienna. He requests a dance. Your mother has drifted closer, listening without appearing to listen. Lord Carrington is a significant catch, titled and wealthy. You accept with the proper degree of pleased surprise. He writes his name on your card with a flourish. As he does, you execute a subtle fan gesture you learned last week, a slight opening, held at chest height, which indicates "I am honoured." He notices. A smile flickers across his face. The message was received and understood. This is why you practice, why you endure the training, why your right hand aches, these tiny moments of successful communication, of being seen and understood within the elaborate rules of the game. The waltz begins not your waltz with Lord Carrington. That comes later, and you watch the dancers from the sidelines. Your fan in your right hand, your posture perfect. You observe the other young women, their fans flickering like fireflies, each gesture deliberate, each movement speaking volumes. Some are more skilled than others. Miss Eleanor Whitmore performs her fan work with particular grace. She's been training since she was 5. You've heard, and it shows. Miss Sarah Chen, daughter of a wealthy merchant, handles her fan competently but without flair. Her family's money grants her access to these events, but her relative newness to high society shows in the slightly mechanical quality of her gestures. And there, across the room, you spot someone making a mistake. Miss Patricia Thornton has just shifted her fan to her left hand, while adjusting her glove with her right. Just for a moment. just for 3 seconds. But Lady Ashford saw it. You saw her see it. And tomorrow, you know, there will be consequences. The evening stretches ahead of you. Hours of performance, hours of vigilance, hours of remembering which hand, always which hand, never the wrong hand, never the natural hand, always the proper hand, your right hand, the only hand that matters, the only hand that exists, really, in the elaborate fiction of Victorian social performance. You take a breath, adjust your grip on the fan, and prepare to survive another night in the glittering, suffocating, absurdly regulated world where a simple choice of which hand to use might determine the entire course of your life. You're sitting in church on Sunday morning, 7 years old, and the vicar is preaching about the sheep and the goats, the righteous and the damned, those who will stand at God's right hand and those who will be cast to the left into eternal darkness. Your left hand, your natural hand, the one that feels right when you reach for things, rests hidden in the folds of your dress. You keep it there as much as possible now, ever since the incident last week when you picked up a hymnal with it and Miss Hartley made you stand in the corner for an hour. The vicar's voice rises and falls, talking about sinister forces and the left-hand path that leads to destruction, and you feel a cold certainty settling into your bones. Your very nature is wrong. God himself has organised the universe with right as good and left as evil, and you are fundamentally, irredeemably on the wrong side. The medieval and religious roots of left-hand prejudice stretch back far beyond Victorian England, winding through centuries of Christian theology, classical philosophy, and folk superstition. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus speaks of the Last Judgment. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. The sheep, the saved, stand at the right hand of God. The goats, the damned, huddle on the left. This spatial metaphor became literal in medieval minds, transforming a storytelling device into cosmic truth. The right side represented virtue, heaven, masculinity, strength, reason. The left side represented sin, hell, femininity, weakness, emotion. The entire moral universe was divided along an axis of handedness, and you, unfortunate child, were born on the wrong side of it. Your grandmother, who is older than anyone else you know and remembers things from the 1790s, tells you stories that make your blood run cold. In her childhood village in Cornwall, left-handed children were suspected of being changelings, fairy creatures swapped for human babies. Some families took their left-handed infants to the church to be exorcised, believing demons had entered them in the womb. Others tied the left hand behind the child's back for years, letting it wither and weaken until it became useless. Your grandmother watched a neighbour boy grow up with his left arm noticeably thinner than his right, the hand pale and weak, the fingers unable to grip anything firmly. But he learned, your grandmother says, her voice carrying a tone you can't identify. Approval, regret. He learned to be proper. You wonder what happened to that boy, whether he resented his ruined arm, whether he ever, in private moments, tried to use it and felt the ghost of what it might have been. The etymology of left-hand terms across European languages reveals the depth of this prejudice. In Latin, sinister means both left and unlucky, or evil. In French, gauche means both left and awkward, or clumsy. In Italian, mancino derives from mancus, meaning maimed or defective. In German, linkish means awkward, coming from link, meaning left. Every language you study carries this bias encoded in its vocabulary, as though humanity collectively agreed that left-handedness was fundamentally wrong and needed to be linguistically punished. Meanwhile, the right hand receives all the positive associations dexterous from Latin dexter, adroit from French adroit, deft from Old English gediefter. The very words you use to describe skill and grace are rooted in right-handedness. Historians still argue whether the bias emerged from practical observation. Most humans are right-handed, making left-handedness statistically unusual and therefore suspect, or whether cultural training actually created the disparity by forcing ambidextrous or weakly left-handed children to use their right hands, thereby inflating the percentage of right-handed adults. The chicken and egg question remains unresolved. What's certain is that by the Victorian era, the prejudice had calcified into unquestioned doctrine, supported by layers of religious, medical, and social theory that made left-handedness seem not just inappropriate but genuinely dangerous. You learn the story of the Last Supper as illustrated in medieval manuscripts, Jesus seated at the centre, his disciples arranged around the table, and Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, always positioned on Jesus' left side. Sometimes Judas is even depicted as left-handed, reaching for bread with his sinister hand, marking himself as the traitor before he's even betrayed anyone. The iconography became so standard that artists didn't need to label Judas. Viewers knew him instantly by his left-side placement. You stare at these images in your father's library books, wondering if the artists ever met actual left-handed people, or if they just painted symbols, reducing complex human beings to simple markers of evil. The connection between left-handedness and witchcraft runs particularly deep in English folk memory. During the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, your history tutor explains this with obvious discomfort, aware that the subject might be too frightening for young ladies. Accused witches were examined for devil's marks, and left-handedness was sometimes considered evidence of demonic association. A woman who stirred her cauldron with her left hand, who wrote with her left hand, who gestured with her left hand might find herself accused of consorting with Satan. The logic was circular, and damning witches used left hands because they served the left-hand path. Therefore, left-handers might be witches. Thousands died, and while left-handedness was rarely the primary evidence, it contributed to the atmosphere of suspicion, the accumulation of wrong details that added up to a death sentence. Your father, who is kinder than most men and more educated, tries to reassure you when he catches you crying over your bound left hand one evening. He explains that the prejudice is fading, that modern science is proving left-handedness is merely a variation in human neurology, not a moral failing, but even he insists you continue your training. The world isn't ready yet, he says, and you hear the exhaustion in his voice. Perhaps in your daughter's time, or her daughter's time, but for now, you must learn to live in the world as it is, not as it should be. You want to ask him why? If he knows the prejudice is wrong, he doesn't fight against it, but you're 8 years old and you understand, in the way children understand adult weakness, that he's doing the best he can within a system he didn't create and can't change. The theological arguments against left-handedness grew increasingly elaborate during the medieval period, as scholars attempted to provide rational explanations for what was essentially superstition. Some argued that Adam, being created in God's perfect image, must have been right-handed, and therefore right-handedness was humanity's natural, prelapsarian state. Left-handedness, in this framework, was a consequence of the fall, a corruption of human nature introduced by sin. Others suggested that the devil, being a twisted mirror image of God, operated through the left hand while God operated through the right. Therefore, to use your left hand was to literally align yourself with Satan rather than God. These weren't fringe theories, they were taught by respected theologians, discussed in universities, accepted as truth by educated people who should have known better. You memorize Bible verses that mention hands, looking for any evidence that God doesn't actually hate your left hand. You find Ecclesiastes. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. Your heart sinks. You find Psalms. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand, until I make thine enemies thy footstool. Right hand again. You search desperately for any positive mention of the left side, the left hand, the left path. You find nothing, or rather, you find only negative associations, warnings, condemnations. The entire sacred text seems organized around the same bias that governs your daily life, that bruises your knuckles, that fills your dreams with guilt. Miss Hartley explains the logic with perfect certainty during one of your lessons. The right hand is associated with giving and honouring because, historically, warriors held weapons in their right hands. To offer your right hand to someone was to demonstrate trust, to show you weren't holding a weapon. The left hand remained free to hold a shield, to protect the heart. Therefore, the right hand became associated with openness, honesty, social connection, while the left hand became associated with defense, protection, hiding, and by extension, deception. You want to point out that left-handed warriors would have held their weapons in their left hands, making the entire argument circular, but you stay silent. Arguing with Miss Hartley only extends the lessons and increases the severity of your corrections. The most disturbing part of all this religious conditioning is how thoroughly it invades your internal life. You begin to feel genuine guilt when your left hand moves instinctively, as though you're committing a sin by existing in your natural state. You pray for God to fix you, to make you normal, to transform your traitorous left hand into a proper, righteous, obedient appendage. When your prayers aren't answered, you wonder if it's because you're too corrupt to deserve divine intervention. The psychological damage accumulates slowly, silently, becoming part of your foundational understanding of yourself. You're wrong. Your body is wrong. Your instincts are wrong. And no amount of training will ever fully erase the wrongness. It will only teach you to hide it more effectively. You're 5 years old, seated at the breakfast table, reaching for your spoon with your left hand because that's what feels natural, what feels right, what your body wants to do. Your father's hand shoots out and slaps the table beside your bowl, making the porridge jump. Right hand, he says quietly, and you switch. This happens 3 times during breakfast. By the end of the meal, you're crying silently, tears dripping into your porridge, but you're using your right hand. Your older brother Charles watches from across the table with an expression you'll later recognize as pity mixed with relief that he was born correct, that he'll never have to endure what you're enduring. Your mother looks away. She's told you in private that she thinks the training is too harsh. But your father insists, and in Victorian households, father's words are law. The correction methods used on left-handed children throughout the 19th century ranged from gentle redirection to outright torture. Depending on the family's social class, regional customs, and the severity of the parents' beliefs about handedness, in your household, the approach is systematic and relentless, but stops short of the truly brutal techniques employed in some families. You've heard whispers about other methods, children whose left hands were tied behind their backs from morning until night, whose left arms were bound to their bodies with bandages soaked in bitter solutions that would stain their clothes if they struggled. You've heard of children whose left hands were struck with rulers so frequently that the bones broke and healed crooked. You've heard of a girl in Essex whose left hand was held over a candle flame for 3 seconds whenever she used it, until she learned to keep it motionless at her side, withered and scarred. Your own correction is milder, or so you're told repeatedly, as though you should be grateful. Miss Hartley uses a ruler across your knuckles, sharp enough to sting but not hard enough to break skin. Your left hand is bound behind your back during lessons, but released for meals and sleep. You wear a special glove on your left hand, made of rough wool that irritates your skin, while your right hand remains bare, a constant physical reminder of which hand is acceptable. The glove becomes your most hated possession. Years later, long after you've been successfully trained, you'll discover it in a trunk in the attic and will experience such a visceral wave of revulsion that you'll throw it into the fire without a second thought, watching the wool blacken and curl, feeling a satisfaction you can't quite justify. The training sessions with Miss Hartley follow a rigid schedule: 2 hours every morning, 1 hour after lunch, another hour before dinner. You sit at a child-sized desk, and she places objects in front of you: a pen, a teacup, a book, a fan, a handkerchief. "Pick it up," she commands. You reach with your right hand, fingers clumsy and uncertain. Again, you pick it up again, and again, and again. 50 times, 100 times, until your right hand has memorized the movement, until the neural pathways have been forcibly carved into your brain. Historians still argue whether this kind of intensive retraining causes lasting neurological damage, or whether the brain simply adapts, creating new dominant pathways while the original left-handed preference remains dormant but intact, waiting for moments of stress or inattention to reassert itself. Some children break quickly, accepting the correction within months and apparently adapting without lasting trauma. Others resist for years, their natural preference so strong that no amount of punishment can fully suppress it. You fall somewhere in the middle, resistant enough to frustrate your teachers, but not so stubborn that you face the escalating punishments reserved for truly recalcitrant children. By age 7, you've learned to perform right-handedness convincingly in public. By age 9, your right hand has developed enough strength and coordination to handle most tasks adequately. By age 12, you sometimes forget which hand is naturally yours, reaching with your right hand automatically and only later experiencing a strange sense of displacement, as though you're watching someone else's hand move. The training has succeeded, but at what cost? You're not sure. The question feels too large, too frightening to examine closely. Your cousin William, who visits from Manchester, tells you about a school he's heard of, where left-handed boys are made to sit on their left hands during lessons, sometimes for 4 or 5 hours straight. The hand goes numb, then painful, then numb again. Some boys lose feeling in their fingers permanently. Others develop a nervous habit of sitting on their left hands even when not required, as though trying to hide the offending appendage from view. William tells you this casually, as though discussing the weather, and you realise he has no idea what he's describing, no understanding of the horror of it. To him, it's just an interesting anecdote about strict schoolmasters. To you, it's a nightmare made real, confirmation that your own suffering could have been worse, much worse. The psychological mechanisms of forced-handedness training reveal themselves slowly as you grow older and gain vocabulary for what was done to you. You're being taught to mistrust your instincts, to override your body's signals, to perform a version of yourself that feels fundamentally false. Child psychologists in the 20th century will document the lasting effects: increased anxiety, perfectionism, a persistent sense of being somehow fraudulent or wrong even when performing correctly. Some forced right-handers develop stutters, the speech disruption thought to result from interfering with the brain's natural lateralization. Others develop fine motor difficulties, their handwriting remaining poor despite years of practice because they're using the non-dominant hand. Still others seem to adapt completely, showing no obvious ill effects, though whether they've truly adapted or simply learned to hide their struggles remains an open question. You develop elaborate private rituals to reclaim tiny moments of left-handed freedom, in your bedroom, alone. You practice writing with your left hand in a journal you keep hidden under a loose floorboard. The letters are shaky at first, unpracticed, but gradually they smooth out. You're teaching yourself to be ambidextrous in secret, maintaining your natural hands abilities while performing right-handedness in public. It feels like maintaining a double identity, like being a spy in your own life. The journal entries are brief and banal. Today was Sunday. We had chicken for dinner. Charles got in trouble for tracking mud through the hall because the content isn't the point. The point is the act itself. The small rebellion of letting your left hand move freely across the page. Miss Hartley catches you once, reading in the library with the book held in your left hand while your right hand turns the pages. She doesn't punish you immediately. Instead, she sits down beside you and speaks in a tone you've never heard from her before, almost gentle, almost sad. "I know it's difficult," she says. "My sister was like you, left-handed. My mother trained her, much as I'm training you. She married well, had 3 children, lived a perfectly respectable life. But she told me once, near the end, that she never stopped feeling wrong, never stopped feeling like she was pretending to be someone else." Miss Hartley pauses, and you hold your breath, hoping for some reprieve, some acknowledgement that this training is cruel and unnecessary. But then she continues, "That's why the training must be so thorough, so that eventually you won't remember what it feels like to be wrong. You'll simply be correct." She takes the book from your left hand and places it in your right. The moment of near vulnerability passes, and you're back to being student and instructor, deviant and corrector. The physical changes in your body accumulate over the years. Your right arm grows noticeably more muscular than your left. Your right shoulder sits slightly higher. Your right hand is larger, the fingers longer and stronger, while your left hand remains smaller, weaker, almost childlike in comparison. You look in the mirror sometimes and see the asymmetry, this visible record of years of forced adaptation. Other people don't notice, or if they do, they don't comment. Slight asymmetry is normal in human bodies. Everyone has a dominant side. But you know your asymmetry is different, more pronounced, the result not of natural development but of systematic suppression. By age 10, you can go entire days without consciously thinking about handedness. The right-hand performance has become automatic enough that it doesn't require constant attention. But the vigilance never fully disappears. There's always a small part of your mind monitoring your movements, ready to catch and correct any left-handed impulse before it becomes visible. This constant low-level anxiety becomes so familiar that you don't recognize it as anxiety. It's just the background state of your existence. The price of passing as normal. Do you remember what it felt like before the training started? When you could reach for things without thinking. When your hands simply moved according to instinct, the memory is already fading, and you're only 10 years old. By the time you're 20, you suspect you won't remember at all. The person you might have been is being slowly erased, replaced by the person society demands you become. And the most disturbing part is that eventually you'll forget there was ever a difference. You're 18 now, standing at the edge of the Winterbourne ballroom during the height of the season, and you're watching a performance more intricate than anything in the opera house down the street. 300 people move through this space like dancers in a ballet, each gesture choreographed, each movement laden with meaning. But it's the fans that tell the real story. Dozens of them flickering through the candlelit air like a swarm of elegant butterflies, each one speaking in the silent language you've spent years mastering. Lady Thornhill opens her fan suddenly while speaking to the Duchess. A sharp snap that everyone within 20 feet can hear. The message is clear even without knowing the specific gestured disagreement. Displeasure. A line has been crossed. The Duchess's fan remains still, closed against her palm. 5 seconds of silence. Then she opens her own fan slowly, deliberately, a measured response that acknowledges the offence without escalating the conflict. Everyone watching understands they've just witnessed a negotiation, possibly even a threat and counter-threat, conducted entirely without words. The choreography of fan movements at Victorian balls reached levels of complexity that modern people find difficult to believe. Entire conversations unfolded through fan gestures, layered beneath and around the spoken dialogue that served as mere camouflage for what was really being communicated. You watch your friend Elizabeth across the room, engaged in what appears to be pleasant small talk with Lord Ashford, but her fan tells a different story. She touches it to her right ear. "You have changed," while smiling and nodding at whatever he's saying. She draws it across her cheek. "I love you," but the speed of the movement suggests the opposite, a mockery of the phrase. She places it against her lips. "Kiss me," and then immediately snaps it shut, the juxtaposition creating something like sarcasm. If sarcasm could be expressed through handheld accessories, Lord Ashford, if he's reading the signals correctly, is being simultaneously flirted with and dismissed, encouraged and warned off. It's a masterpiece of mixed messaging, and Elizabeth performs it flawlessly, her right hand executing each movement with the precision of the concert pianist. The music swells, a Strauss waltz that pulls dancers onto the floor in matched pairs. You watch how the women manage their fans during the dance. Some tuck them into their sashes or hang them from wrist cords, leaving their hands free for the waltz position. Others keep them in their right hands throughout, the fan becoming part of the dance itself, opening and closing in time with the music, adding an extra layer of movement to the already complex choreography. The most skilled dancers make it look effortless, as though the fan is simply an extension of their bodies, as natural as an arm or leg. You know the reality: thousands of hours of practice, sore wrists, cramped fingers, the constant vigilance required to ensure the fan remains in the correct hand, moves at the correct speed, opens to the correct angle. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the entire performance collapses. Historians still argue whether the elaborate fan language was actually used as extensively as Victorian etiquette manuals suggest, or whether it was more of an aspirational standard that few people actually achieved. Some scholars point to the proliferation of instructional pamphlets and magazine articles as evidence that the language was real and widely practiced. Others argue that the very need for so many instructional materials proves that most people didn't actually know the language well and were constantly trying to learn it. The truth probably varies by social circle and region. In the highest levels of society, where young women received intensive training from childhood, fan language was likely fluent and nuanced. In the middle classes, where families were trying to climb socially, it was probably more like a foreign language learned imperfectly from books, grammatically correct but lacking native fluency. And in the working classes, it barely existed at all, replaced by more direct forms of communication. You notice a young woman you don't recognise standing near the refreshment table, her fan hanging awkwardly from her left wrist while she holds a glass of punch in her right hand. The moment she sets down the glass, she transfers the fan to her left hand, not because she's left-handed necessarily, but because she simply doesn't know the rules. She's probably merchant class, recently wealthy, granted access to these events through her father's business connections, but lacking the years of training that would make her movements automatic. You watch as Lady Pemberton notices the transgression, leans toward her daughter, and whispers something behind her own perfectly positioned fan. The daughter glances at the unfortunate girl and smirks. Tomorrow, the girl's name will be circulating in drawing rooms across London, attached to the story of her social incompetence. She'll probably never be invited to an event like this again. One mistake, 30 seconds of holding her fan in the wrong hand, and her social aspirations are finished. The cruelty of it strikes you, as it does periodically when you see someone else suffer the consequences you've worked so hard to avoid, The system is designed to exclude, to create and maintain hierarchies, to ensure that only those who've undergone the proper training can successfully navigate its complexities. And handedness is just one element. There are rules about dress, about speech, about posture, about whom you can acknowledge and whom you must pretend not to see. The fan language is perhaps the most elaborate element, requiring not just knowledge but physical skill, muscle memory, the kind of embodied understanding that comes only from years of practice. It's a barrier to entry that's almost impossible to overcome if you didn't start learning as a child. Your dance partner for the next waltz approaches James Hartwick, third son of an earl. Pleasant enough, if somewhat boring. As he leads you onto the floor, you tuck your fan into your sash, the approved method for waltz management. His hand rests properly at your waist. Your right hand rests in his left. Your left hand on his shoulder. The position is so ingrained you don't think about it anymore. But you remember learning it. Remember Miss Hartley adjusting your posture millimetre by millimetre until it was perfect. The waltz begins, and you move through the familiar steps, conscious of dozens of watching eyes evaluating your performance. Not just your dancing, anyone can learn the basic steps, but the quality of your movement, the grace of your posture, the way you hold your head, the angle of your free hand, all the tiny details that mark you as truly accomplished versus merely adequate. Between dances, you retrieve your fan and immediately employ it, not because you're overheated, though the ballroom is stifling, but because standing without your fan would leave you vulnerable, unable to communicate in the silent language everyone around you is speaking. You observe the complex negotiations unfolding across the room. Mrs. Ashford fans herself rapidly while speaking to Mrs., with more anxiety or agitation, the rapid movement betraying her emotional state even as her face remains composed. Miss Thornton holds her fan against her heart while watching Lieutenant Crawford across the room. The gesture is unsubtle, almost embarrassingly direct, and you see other women notice and exchange knowing glances. The lieutenant, if he's noticed, gives no sign. He's deep in conversation with other military men, occasionally gesturing with his champagne glass, but oblivious to the silent declaration of affection being broadcast in his direction. You wonder sometimes what would happen if everyone simply stopped, if all the women in this ballroom simultaneously decided to abandon the elaborate fan choreography and just speak plainly. What if Miss Thornton walked up to Lieutenant Crawford and said, "I find you attractive and would like to know you better"? What if Mrs. Ashford told Mrs. Whitmore directly whatever is agitating her? Instead of communicating through rapid fan movements, what if you yourself could simply exist in this space without constantly monitoring which hand is doing what the thought is simultaneously liberating and terrifying? The structure is oppressive, certainly, but it's also safe in its way. The rules may be rigid, but at least they're clear. You know how to operate within them. Direct communication, by contrast, would require a kind of courage you're not sure you possess. The evening progresses through its established rhythms, dances, conversations, refreshments, promenades around the room. Your fan work is flawless. You've reached the point where you no longer consciously think about it. The movements flow automatically, your right hand executing them with the precision of long practice. You catch your mother's eye across the room, and she nods slightly, approval evident in her expression. You've performed well tonight. No mistakes, no lapses, no moments of carelessness that might damage your reputation. The relief you feel is exhausting in itself, the constant pressure to maintain perfection, to never slip, to always be the right kind of woman performing the right kind of movements with the right hand. Near midnight, you step onto the balcony for a moment of relative privacy. Though even here you're not truly alone, other couples and small groups occupy the space, maintaining the necessary propriety of public togetherness. You hold your fan in your right hand, closed now, resting against the balcony railing. The night air is cool against your overheated skin. Your right wrist aches deeply, a familiar sensation you've learned to ignore. In the distance, you can hear the city carriages on cobblestones, a dog barking, the river flowing past somewhere in the darkness. For just a moment, you allow yourself to imagine a different life, one where hands are just hands, where you could reach for things without thinking, where your body could move according to its own instincts rather than society's dictates. But the moment passes. You turn back toward the ballroom, your fan ready in your proper hand, prepared to continue the performance that is your life. You're 22 years old, married now for 6 months to a man who seems kind enough, and you're sitting at your dressing table while your lady's maid arranges your hair for an evening reception. In the mirror, you watch your right hand rest naturally on your lap, positioned just as Miss Hartley taught you 15 years ago. Your left hand lies beside it, smaller and weaker, the fingers slightly curled inward from years of comparative disuse. Your husband doesn't know. In 6 months of marriage, through courtship and engagement and the wedding itself and all the intimate moments that followed, he has never once suspected that this perfect right-handed performance he's witnessed is anything other than your natural state. You've hidden it so completely that even you sometimes forget. Sometimes reach for things with your right hand and only later experience that strange flutter of displacement, that whisper of wrongness that reminds you who you really are beneath the training. The secret lives of left-handed Victorian ladies constitute one of history's quieter tragedies, not dramatic enough for novels, not significant enough for historical records, but deeply personal and persistently painful. You know you're not alone. At the reception last week, you noticed Lady Caroline Hartwell's asymmetry, the way her right arm seemed overdeveloped compared to her left, the subtle wrongness in how she held her teacup. You recognised it immediately because you carry the same markers yourself. Your eyes met across the room, and something passed between you: recognition, perhaps, or solidarity, or simply the acknowledgement that you both understood something others didn't. Neither of you spoke of it. What would you say? I notice you're also living a lie, also performing a version of yourself that feels fundamentally false, also wondering sometimes who you might have been if society had allowed you to exist as yourself. The conversation would be too dangerous, too revealing, too likely to crack the careful facades you've both constructed. You've learned to live in layers. There's the public self right-handed, proper, perfectly trained that everyone sees. There's the private self that emerges in rare moments of solitude, when you allow your left hand to pick up a book or brush your hair or perform any of the dozen small tasks that feel more natural with your true dominant hand. And beneath both of these is something deeper, harder to articulate, a sense of your authentic self that exists independent of hand preference. A person who might have developed differently if her fundamental nature hadn't required constant suppression. You'll never meet that person. She's a ghost, a might have been, a parallel self existing in a world where left-handedness was accepted or at least tolerated. Sometimes you dream about her. She's confident in ways you're not, comfortable in her own body in ways you've never been. She reaches for things without thinking, writes naturally, gestures freely. When you wake, the sense of loss is so profound you have to sit at the edge of the bed for several minutes before you can begin your day. Historians still argue whether the psychological damage of forced-handedness training was as severe as modern researchers suggest, or whether Victorian people were more resilient, more accepting of such corrections as simply part of growing up. The historical record is frustratingly silent on the subject. Women's diaries occasionally mention handedness training taught Sarah her letters today, had to correct her hand position repeatedly, but rarely discussed the emotional impact. Whether this silence reflects genuine lack of trauma or simply the Victorian tendency to suffer privately remains unknowable. You keep your own diary, but you've never written about your left-handedness. The fear of discovery is too great. What if your husband found it? What if a servant read it while cleaning? What if it somehow became public? The revelation wouldn't ruin you socially. You've performed right-handedness too long and too well for anyone to suspect otherwise. But it would change how people saw you, would mark you as someone with something to hide, someone whose perfect surface conceals imperfection beneath. Your friend Margaret, now living in Edinburgh with her professor husband, writes you long letters about her life. In one recent letter, she confessed something that made your heart race her husband knows about her left-handedness. She told him during their engagement, feeling he deserved to know before committing to marriage. His response, she wrote, was extraordinary. He asked why she'd felt the need to confess something so insignificant. He assured her he didn't care which hand felt more natural to her, that she could use either or both in their private home, that he had no interest in policing her body's instincts. Margaret writes that she still performs right-handedness in public, but in their home, she's begun to reclaim her left hand. It's like learning to breathe properly after a lifetime of shallow breathing, she wrote. I didn't realize how much energy the performance required until I could stop performing, at least some of the time. You read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions you can't quite name: joy for Margaret, envy, hope, and a deep sadness because you know you'll never have what she has. Your husband is kind, but he's also conventional, deeply invested in propriety and social standing. Telling him would risk everything, not the marriage itself. Perhaps, but the easy warmth between you. The unquestioned assumption that you're the woman you appear to be. The double life requires constant vigilance. You've developed elaborate routines to ensure you never slip. Before leaving your private chambers each morning, you spend 5 minutes practicing right-handed movements, picking up objects, gesturing, holding your fan until your body has shifted into performance mode. Throughout the day, you maintain a low-level awareness of your hands, ready to catch and correct any left-handed impulse before it becomes visible. Only in your bedroom, alone, door locked, curtains drawn. Do you allow yourself complete freedom? You write in your secret journal with your left hand, the letters flowing easily after years of private practice. You brush your hair left-handed, button your nightgown left-handed, arrange items on your dressing table left-handed. These small rebellions sustain you, remind you that beneath the performance, you still exist. You've noticed your left-handed nature reasserting itself in moments of stress or illness. Last month, when you had a terrible headache and were lying in a darkened room, you reached for the bell to summon your maid and your left hand moved first. You caught yourself, switched hands, rang the bell properly. But the moment frightened you, your control isn't absolute, and in moments of weakness, your true nature might reveal itself. You've heard stories of elderly women whose strokes or dementia caused them to revert to left-handedness after decades of forced right-handedness. Their damaged brains unable to maintain the learned behaviour. The servants would whisper about it, shocked and disturbed, as though the women had suddenly revealed themselves to be witches or demons. You wonder if that will be your fate, a lifetime of careful performance followed by a final revelation when your mind can no longer maintain the lie. The physical consequences of your double life accumulate slowly. Your right hand, overused and strained, develops early arthritis. Your doctor prescribes rest, but rest is impossible when that hand must perform all your public tasks. Your left hand, comparatively underused, lacks the strength and coordination it should have. You're neither fully right-handed nor fully left-handed anymore. You're something in between, something unnatural, a creature created by society's demands rather than nature's design. Your posture has suffered 2 years of favouring your right side have left you slightly twisted, your right shoulder higher than your left, your spine curved in ways it shouldn't be. You wear corsets that help disguise the asymmetry, but you feel it. A constant reminder of the price your body has paid for social acceptance. Sometimes you fantasize about confession, about telling your husband or your mother or even your lady's maid the truth about your handedness. In these fantasies, they respond with understanding and support, assuring you it doesn't matter, that they love you regardless. But you know these are just fantasies. The real world is less forgiving. Your mother trained you in forced right-handedness. She's not going to suddenly decide it was wrong. Your husband married the woman you appeared to be, the right-handed lady who performed every gesture perfectly. Revealing the truth would feel like a betrayal, a fundamental dishonesty about who you are. And your lady's maid, well, servants gossip and gossip spreads, and soon everyone would know, and your carefully constructed reputation would develop a flaw that could never be repaired. You live with the peculiar loneliness of having a secret that isn't dramatic enough to matter to anyone but you. You're not conducting an affair, not hiding financial ruin, not concealing a scandalous past. You're simply left-handed, a trivial variation in human neurology that shouldn't matter at all. But it does matter. It matters every single day, in hundreds of tiny moments, in the constant vigilance required to maintain the performance, in the accumulated psychological weight of living as someone you're not. Do you remember what it felt like in those early training sessions, before the behaviour became automatic, when every right-handed movement required conscious effort and concentration? You're still there, in a sense. The movements are automatic now, but the effort remains, translated from conscious struggle to unconscious tension that you carry in your shoulders, your jaw, your perpetually tired right wrist. You're exhausted in ways that have no name, tired from a struggle no one acknowledges because no one knows it's happening, and you'll carry this exhaustion for the rest of your life, dying someday as a woman whose true nature remained hidden even from those who loved her, a ghost haunting her own existence. You're observing from the edge of another ballroom, but tonight your perspective has shifted. You're watching the men now, studying how they observe the women, how they've been trained in an entirely different set of skills that complement and complete the elaborate dance of fan communication. Your husband stands 15 feet away in a cluster of other gentlemen, and you notice how his eyes track the room systematically, cataloguing gestures, decoding movements, assessing the silent conversations unfolding through fan work. He's been trained for this just as thoroughly as you were, though his education took a different form. While you learned to speak the language, he learned to read it. While you practiced movements until they became automatic, he practiced observation until it became instinctive. The system requires both performers and audience, speakers and listeners, and the gentlemen of Victorian society have been carefully prepared for their role. The education of Victorian gentlemen in fan language begins earlier than most people realise, not through formal instruction like the girls receive, but through years of casual observation and pointed commentary. Your husband once told you, in an unguarded moment, about his father taking him to balls as a young boy and whispering interpretations of what they were seeing. Watch Mrs. Ashford see how she's holding her fan against her cheek. That means she's interested in Lord Pemberton but doesn't want to appear too eager. The lessons accumulated gradually, building a vocabulary of understanding that became second nature by the time young men entered society themselves. By 18 or 20, A properly educated gentleman could read fan language as fluently as he read English, could observe a ballroom and understand the complex web of attractions, rejections, negotiations, and rivalries playing out in silence beneath the polite conversation. The male perspective on fan etiquette reveals aspects of the system that women rarely discuss among themselves. Gentlemen are taught to watch not just for the messages being sent, but for the quality of the performance itself. A woman who handles her fan awkwardly, who fumbles her gestures or executes them with visible effort, marks herself as imperfectly trained, possibly lower class, certainly less desirable as a wife. The fan becomes a test of breeding and education as much as communication device. Your husband once mentioned, trying to compliment you, that your fan work was absolutely flawless, never a moment's hesitation or uncertainty. You thanked him, feeling a complex mixture of pride and resentment. The flawlessness he admired was purchased with years of pain, correction, and suppression. But he had no way of knowing that. He saw only the successful performance, never the suffering that created it. Historians still argue whether men were as fluent in fan language as the etiquette manuals suggest, or whether many gentlemen simply pretended to understand while actually missing most of the nuanced communication. Certainly some men were more observant than others, more interested in decoding the silent language, more invested in the elaborate social games that fan communication enabled. Others probably caught only the most obvious signals a fan snapped shut in anger, a clear gesture of invitation or dismissal, while missing the subtler layers of meaning. The variation in male competence likely paralleled the variation in female skill, just as some women mastered fan language completely, while others struggled. Some men became expert readers, while others remained relatively oblivious. You watch as Lord Ashford approaches Miss Elizabeth Winters, who's been sending increasingly obvious signals in his direction for the past 20 minutes. Her fan work has been almost comically unsubtle, touching it to her heart, drawing it slowly across her lips, holding it in the classic "I wish to speak with you" position. Lord Ashford, who is either genuinely oblivious or pretending to be for reasons of his own, has ignored every signal. He stops now to speak with her, but his posture is formal, his expression polite but distant. Miss Winter's fan movements become more agitated, frustration evident in the rapid flickering. Her mother, watching from across the room, looks pained. Tomorrow there will be a private conversation about subtlety, about the dangers of appearing too eager, about maintaining dignity even in disappointment. You've witnessed versions of this scene dozens of times, the desperate signalling, the deliberate or accidental misreading, the social consequences that follow. The gentleman's ability to observe fan signals extended beyond simple reading to active surveillance for errors and improprieties. Your husband and his peers were trained to notice not just what messages were being sent, but whether they were being sent correctly. A woman using her left hand, even momentarily, would be immediately noticed by any properly observant gentleman. The error would become part of her reputation, a mark against her that might affect her marriage prospects, her social standing, her entire future. The cruelty of this system strikes you forcefully. Women were expected to perform flawlessly under constant surveillance, knowing that any mistake would be observed, judged, and remembered by dozens of watchful eyes. You've learned to read the men's observations almost as well as they read women's fan signals. You can tell when a gentleman has noticed an error by the slight pause in his conversation, the flicker of his eyes toward the offending woman, the almost imperceptible adjustment of his posture that signals something noteworthy has occurred. You've seen men exchange glances after witnessing a faux pas, silent communication between observers that excludes the woman who made the mistake entirely. She might not even realize she's been judged, might continue through the evening unaware that her reputation has just taken damage that will persist for years. The economics of observation become clear when you consider the marriage market. Gentlemen are investing their family names, their wealth, their futures in the women they marry. They must assess not just beauty or personality, but breeding, training, the subtle markers of proper upbringing that predict whether a woman will be an asset or liability in society. Fan work provides one of the clearest indicators. A woman who handles her fan with unconscious grace, who performs every gesture correctly without apparent effort, who never makes mistakes even in moments of stress or excitement. Such a woman has received the intensive training that marks true quality. She comes from a family with resources, standards, connections. She'll know how to manage a household, raise children properly, navigate society successfully. The fan is synecdoche for her entire value as a potential wife. Your brother Charles, visiting from Cambridge, once explained the male perspective with startling frankness. You were walking in the garden, far enough from the house to speak freely, and he told you that his friends conducted actual rankings of the season's debutantes based partly on fan work quality. They'd observe at balls and parties, comparing notes afterward, assigning scores. It sounds cruel when I say it aloud, he admitted, but it's remarkably predictive. The girls who score highest in fan work almost always make the best matches. The skill correlates with everything else: family background, education, temperament. You asked him what happened to girls who scored poorly, and his expression grew uncomfortable. They either marry down or wait several seasons, hoping their skills improve or hoping to meet someone less observant. The casual brutality of it left you speechless. These were people's lives being reduced to scores based on how they held handheld accessories. The detection of left-handedness occupied a special category in gentlemen's observational training. It wasn't just another error to notice. It was a fundamental revelation about a woman's nature. A woman who briefly used her left hand might be tired or distracted, forgivable errors. But a woman who consistently showed left-handed tendencies, who had to catch and correct herself repeatedly, who displayed the telltale asymmetry of forced training, such a woman was revealing something deeper. She was showing that her surface perfection required constant effort, that beneath the performance was someone different, someone potentially unreliable. Gentlemen were explicitly taught to be suspicious of left-handed women, to see left-handedness as a marker of possible deeper deceptions or instabilities. You've spent years wondering what your husband would think if he knew. Would he be angry at the deception, disappointed that you weren't naturally the perfect right-handed lady he thought he'd married? Or would he, like Margaret's husband, consider it insignificant? You'll never know because you'll never tell him. The risk is too great. Your marriage is built on his perception of you as a certain kind of woman, and revealing your left-handedness might crack that foundation in ways you can't predict or control. So you maintain the performance, and he maintains his observation, and the elaborate dance continues with neither of you acknowledging that it's a dance at all. The male gaze, that constant evaluating, judging presence, becomes so internalized that you carry it with you even when alone. You've absorbed their perspective. Learn to see yourself as they see you, to evaluate your own performance by their standards. This internalized observer never sleeps, never stops watching, never grants you full privacy even in your own mind. It's perhaps the most insidious aspect of the whole system, not just that you must perform for others, but that you must perform for the version of others that lives permanently in your consciousness, judging every gesture, noting every error, maintaining the vigilance that society demands. You've become both performer and audience, watched and watcher, trapped in a hall of mirrors where every reflection shows you the woman you're pretending to be, never the woman you actually are. You're sitting in a Chinese tea house in London's Limehouse district, A rare adventure your husband permitted because you claimed an interest in Oriental decorative arts. And you're watching something that makes your carefully constructed world tilt slightly on its axis. The Chinese proprietress moves through the space with a grace that rivals any English lady's, but her fan delicate painted silk with bamboo sticks rests comfortably in her left hand. She gestures with it, cools herself with it, uses it to indicate items on the menu, all with her left hand, and no one in this space seems to find it remarkable or wrong. You're transfixed, unable to look away from this casual violation of everything you've been taught. Your companion, Mrs. Hartwell, you remember recognizing her asymmetry at that reception notices where your attention is fixed. Different customs, she murmurs, but her voice carries a weight of meaning that has nothing to do with cultural relativism. The variations in fan etiquette across global cultures reveal the arbitrary nature of rules that seemed absolute within English society. In China and Japan, where fan traditions stretch back centuries before European adoption, handedness carries different associations, or sometimes no particular association at all. Chinese opera performers use fans with either hand depending on the character and the gesture's meaning. Japanese courtesans develop extraordinary ambidextrous fan skills, able to perform complex movements with both hands simultaneously. In Spain, the language of fans reached levels of elaboration that made English fan communication look simple by comparison. But Spanish ladies often held fans in their left hands while their right hands managed rosaries or prayer books. Even within Europe, customs varied. Italian ladies seemed more relaxed about handedness. French society followed rules similar to English ones, but with regional variations. German customs differed between northern and southern regions. The cultural relativism hits you with peculiar force because it undermines the theological and moral justifications you've absorbed since childhood. If left-handedness is genuinely evil, genuinely associated with Satan and sin, why do entire civilizations apparently remain ignorant of this cosmic truth? Are Chinese Christians instructed to avoid left-handed fan use? Do Japanese converts to Catholicism undergo the same forced training you endured? Or does the supposed moral imperative reveal itself as merely cultural preference? Arbitrary as any fashion or custom, historians still argue about whether 19th-century anthropologists and missionaries recognized this contradiction and how they reconciled universal moral claims with obvious cultural variation. Some missionaries apparently did try to correct left-handedness in converts, viewing it as part of the civilizing mission. Others focused on what they considered more important matters and ignored handedness entirely. You watch the Chinese proprietress pour tea left-handed, and you feel something dangerous stirring in your chest. Envy, certainly, but also anger. This woman moves through her world without the constant vigilance that exhausts you, without the internalized surveillance that never sleeps, without the decades of training that carved your natural instincts out of you and replaced them with acceptable performance. She exists in her body comfortably, unself-consciously, in ways you've never been permitted. The injustice of it that you were born a few thousand miles from here, and that geographical accident determined whether your left hand would be a neutral tool or a moral failing requiring correction, strikes you as almost unbearable. Mrs. Hartwell orders tea in careful English, the proprietress responding in accented but fluent sentences. You notice Mrs. Hartwell's right hand resting on the table, fingers slightly curled, while her left hand hidden in her lap flexes and stretches in tiny movements. She's exercising it, you realize, trying to maintain some strength in the atrophied limb. The recognition creates a moment of perfect understanding between you. You're both watching this Chinese woman with a complex mixture of fascination and grief, seeing in her casual left-handedness a possibility that was stolen from you, a version of existence you'll never experience. The proprietress notices your attention and smiles, gesturing with her left-handed fan toward a display of Chinese fans for sale. "You like very beautiful, from Suzhou," she says, and you find yourself nodding, standing, walking over to examine them. They're exquisite painted silk depicting plum blossoms, mountains, calligraphy and characters you cannot read. You pick one up with your right hand automatically, the gesture so ingrained you don't even think about it, but then, glancing around to ensure no other English patrons are watching, you transfer it to your left hand. Just for a moment, just to feel what it's like. The fan feels right in your left palm, the balance perfect. Your fingers knowing instinctively how to hold it, how to open it, how to gesture with it. 15 years of training haven't erased this knowledge, they've merely suppressed it. Mrs. Hartwell watches you with an expression you can't quite read. The global perspective on handedness that you're glimpsing here, partial and mediated through your limited experience, raises questions you've never been permitted to ask. If different cultures have different rules, if the Chinese can be perfectly civilized and sophisticated while ignoring handedness, if Spanish ladies communicate with left-handed fans without apparent moral decay, then what exactly are English customs protecting? What disaster would actually occur if you used your left hand? You know the answer. Social consequences, not cosmic ones. You'd face gossip, damaged reputation, reduced marriage prospects, all real and serious within your society, but all fundamentally arbitrary, maintained by collective agreement rather than natural law or divine command. You purchase the Chinese fan, knowing you'll never use it in public, that it will join your secret collection of left-handed objects kept hidden in your private chambers. But owning it feels like a small act of rebellion, an acknowledgement that other ways of existing are possible even if you'll never access them yourself. The proprietress wraps it carefully in silk paper, and as she hands it to you left-handed, your fingers touch hers for just a moment. You wonder what she thinks of English ladies with their rigid rules and their obvious discomfort. Does she pity you? Does she find your customs amusing? Does she even notice the asymmetry you carry? The markers of forced training that seem so obvious to you outside the tea house? Back in properly English streets, you and Mrs. Hartwell walk in silence for several minutes. Finally, she speaks. "My daughter is left-handed. She's 6. I've been trying to decide whether to train her as I was trained, whether to put her through what we endured." She pauses, watching your face for reaction. "Part of me thinks society might be changing, that by the time she's grown, perhaps the rules will have relaxed. But another part knows I'd be gambling with her future, that if I'm wrong, she'll face consequences I can't protect her from. You understand the impossible position perpetuate the trauma or risk your child's social standing. You're grateful you've had no children yet, grateful you don't have to make this choice. What would you do? Force your daughter to endure what you endured, or raise her as herself and hope the world changes in time?" There's no good answer. Mrs. Hartwell continues. "Sometimes I let her use her left hand at home. When no servants are watching, she's so happy, so natural. Then we go out and I have to correct her, have to watch her face fall as she switches hands, as she remembers she's wrong." Her voice breaks slightly. "I'm doing to her what was done to me, and I hate myself for it, but I don't know what else to do." You take her hand, your right hand holding hers, proper and correct even in this moment of shared grief. You want to tell her it will be all right, that her daughter will adapt as you both adapted, that the training will become automatic and the pain will fade. But you can't lie. The pain doesn't fade. It just becomes familiar, transforms from acute suffering to chronic ache, the background noise of a life lived in performance. The comparative cultural perspective you've glimpsed today won't change your life. You'll return home, resume your careful performance. Maintain the vigilance that has defined your existence for 2 decades. But something has shifted. You've seen evidence that your suffering was unnecessary, that the rules that shaped you were arbitrary, that you've been sacrificed to customs that other civilizations manage without. The knowledge doesn't free you. You're still trapped in English society, still subject to its rules, still dependent on maintaining your reputation for your survival. But the knowledge exists now, a small seed of understanding that maybe, possibly, someday, in some future you'll never see. Things might be different. The women who come after you might grow up in a world that allows them to exist as themselves, to use whichever hand feels natural, to move through space without constant surveillance and correction. You'll never experience that freedom yourself, but knowing it's theoretically possible provides a strange, melancholy comfort as you walk back towards your proper English life. Your right hand properly positioned, your left-handedness hidden away where it's always been, where it will remain until you die. You're sitting in Dr. Pemberton's consultation room in Harley Street, your husband beside you, and the doctor is explaining with absolute confidence why your persistent right-hand tremor is actually caused by hysteria of the feminine nervous system, rather than what you suspect 20 years of forcing a non-dominant hand to perform as dominant. The doctor has an elaborate theory involving the womb, vapours, and moral weakness. He prescribes bed rest, avoidance of stimulating literature, and a tonic that tastes of metal and makes you drowsy. He does not ask whether you might be left-handed, does not examine your asymmetry, does not consider that your body might be breaking down under the strain of decades of unnatural performance. Victorian medical theory has no framework for understanding what you know instinctively, that you're injured by your own enforced normality. The medical theories surrounding handedness in the 19th century combined genuine scientific observation with spectacular nonsense, creating a body of literature that was simultaneously sophisticated and absurd. Doctors had noticed that the brain's hemispheres controlled opposite sides of the body, that damage to the left hemisphere often affected right side movement and speech. From these legitimate observations, they constructed elaborate theories about brain organization, intelligence, and moral character that happen to support existing prejudices. Left-handedness, many physicians argued, resulted from minor brain damage, abnormal development, or hereditary degeneration. Some theorized that left-handed people had reversed brain organization, making them fundamentally different from normal right-handers, not just in handedness, but in reasoning ability, emotional stability, and moral character. Doctor. Pemberton pulls out a phrenology chart, pointing to regions of the skull he claims correspond to handedness, morality, and feminine virtue. He runs his fingers over your head, pressing points that supposedly reveal your inner character. Interesting, he murmurs, making notes. The right side dominance centres are well developed, as one would expect in a lady of quality, no abnormalities detected. You want to laugh at the absurdity of it. Want to scream that the abnormality is precisely what he's praising, the forced overdevelopment of your right side, the deliberate suppression of your left. But you remain silent, playing the role of the concerned patient seeking expert guidance. Your husband watches with complete confidence in the doctor's authority, never questioning whether this man might be completely wrong. Historians still argue about when exactly medical understanding of handedness began to shift from moral judgment to neurological curiosity. A few pioneering researchers in the 1860s and 1870s started investigating handedness as a biological variable rather than a character flaw. They measured reaction times, strength differences, coordination in both hands. Some even suggested that forcing left-handed children to use their right hands might cause psychological harm. But these voices remained marginal throughout the Victorian era, drowned out by the louder chorus of doctors who insisted left-handedness indicated degeneracy, atavism, or mental deficiency. The scientific method existed, but it was applied selectively, confirming what researchers already believed rather than challenging their assumptions. The specific medical explanations for left-handedness reveal the era's combination of observation and fantasy. One prominent theory held that left-handed children resulted from improper fetal positioning in the womb. The baby had developed backwards, and the handedness was merely one visible symptom of a more general reversal that might include other hidden abnormalities. Another theory blamed birth trauma, suggesting that damage during delivery had disrupted normal brain development, leaving the child dependent on the wrong hemisphere. Still another attributed left-handedness to hereditary factors, tracing it through family lines like any other degenerative condition. Some doctors even proposed that left-handedness was more common in criminals, epileptics, and the insane acclaim supported by cherry-picked data and circular reasoning. Doctor. Pemberton prescribes a treatment regime that would be comical if it weren't your actual life. You're to spend 2 hours daily lying in a darkened room with damp cloths over your eyes, supposedly to calm your overexcited nerves. You're to avoid all intellectual stimulation, no reading beyond light novels, no challenging conversation, no activities that might tax your delicate feminine brain. You're to take regular doses of his tonic, which you later discover contains primarily alcohol and opium. And critically, you're to minimize use of your right hand, giving it complete rest for at least 6 weeks. This last prescription fills you with something approaching panic. If you don't use your right hand, your left hand will take over automatically. And then what? Will you reveal yourself after all these years? Will your carefully maintained performance finally crack? You attempt to explain the impossibility of this to Dr. Pemberton. But doctor, if I don't use my right hand, how will I manage daily activities? How will I write letters? Hold my fan at social events? Perform all the necessary tasks. He waves away your concerns with magnificent condescension. My dear Mrs. Hartwell, you must trust the medical expertise. Your right hand requires rest. Surely you can withdraw from society for 6 weeks. Your health must take precedence. Your husband nods agreement, already mentally composing the notes he'll send declining social invitations. Neither man understands what they're asking. Neither sees the trap they're constructing. You'll either disobey the doctor's orders and continue damaging your right hand, or you'll obey and risk exposing your left-handedness to your household staff, your husband, anyone who observes you during your supposed recovery. The treatment of right-hand strain injuries in left-handed people forced into right-handedness represents a blind spot in Victorian medicine. Doctors saw the symptoms: tremors, weakness, pain, loss of coordination, but couldn't or wouldn't trace them to their actual cause. They prescribed rest for the injured hand without considering what would happen when the patient's natural dominant hand took over. They noted the psychological distress that often accompanied these injuries, but attributed it to feminine hysteria, rather than the fundamental wrongness of living in a body you've been taught to mistrust. The medical establishment, like society generally, was so invested in the rightness of right-handedness that it couldn't recognize the harm it was doing, even when that harm presented in their examination rooms. You leave Dr. Pemberton's office with your prescriptions and return home to face the impossible situation. For the first week, you try to obey. You minimize right-hand use while maintaining enough activity to avoid suspicion. You write letters with your left hand but destroy them, copying them over in shaky right-handed script before sending. You practice eating left-handed in your private chambers, but switch to your right hand for family meals. The strain of this new layer of performance, added to your existing exhaustion, pushes you towards something like breakdown. You sleep poorly, wake with headaches, cry for reasons you can't articulate to your concerned husband. By the second week, you've stopped even pretending to follow the treatment. Your right hand continues its trembling, the pain spreading up your forearm into your shoulder. You develop a new symptom, periodic numbness in your right fingers. Moments when you can't feel what you're holding, when objects slip from your grasp. At a tea party, you drop your fan twice. The second time watching in horror as it skitters across the floor, the delicate sticks cracking against table legs. Lady Pemberton retrieves it for you with a look of concern that contains, "You're certain." A note of satisfied judgment, "Mrs." Hartwell is losing control. The look says something is wrong beneath her perfect surface. Your lady's maid, Sarah, finds you one afternoon sitting at your dressing table crying silently, your left hand clenched in your right, as though you could somehow force them to merge, to become one ambidextrous appendage that would satisfy everyone. Sarah, who has known you for 3 years and never seen you use your left hand for anything significant, hesitates in the doorway. Then she crosses the room, kneels beside you and says quietly, "My sister was left-handed. They trained her out of it, same as you. She told me once it felt like being slowly erased, like the real her was being scrubbed away until only the performance remained." You stare at her, shocked that she's seen through you, terrified of what she might do with this knowledge. But Sarah simply squeezes your hand, your left hand, and adds, "Your secret is safe with me, ma'am. It always has been." The realization that your servant has known all along, has observed your asymmetry and understood its meaning, has watched you perform for years while recognizing the performance, this knowledge cracks something in you. If Sarah knew, who else knows? How many people have seen through you while politely pretending to believe the fiction? How much energy have you wasted hiding something that wasn't actually hidden? The questions spiral, making you dizzy. Sarah helps you to bed, brings you tea, sits with you while you cry harder than you've cried since childhood. She doesn't offer solutions because there are no solutions. She simply bears witness to your suffering, just acknowledges it as real. And that acknowledgement is itself a kind of relief. Someone sees you. Someone knows. And the world hasn't ended. You're reading the morning newspaper over breakfast, your trembling right hand making the pages rattle slightly. When you come across a small item buried in the society pages, Miss Catherine Thornbury has been withdrawn from the season after an incident at Lady Westmore's ball, where she was observed repeatedly using her left hand to manage her fan. The announcement is brief, clinical, but you can read between the lines a family in crisis, a young woman's prospects destroyed, parents scrambling to contain the damage. You know the Thornbury family slightly. Catherine's mother once commented favourably on your own fan work. You wonder if Catherine was naturally left-handed and her training finally failed under the pressure of her debut season, or if she simply made a mistake, reached with the wrong hand in a moment of distraction, and that single error metastasized into scandal. The social consequences of left-handed fan use played out across Victorian society with varying degrees of severity, but they were always real and often devastating. A young woman's debut season represented her family's investment of thousands of pounds, years of preparation, carefully cultivated social connections, all focused on the singular goal of making an advantageous marriage. One visible, prolonged error could unravel everything. The Thornbury situation will likely follow a predictable pattern. Catherine will be sent to stay with relatives in the countryside, ostensibly for her health, actually for damage control. She'll spend a year or more out of sight while the family works to minimise the scandal. When she eventually re-enters society, it will be with lowered expectations, acceptable matches having been replaced by whoever will overlook her tarnished reputation. Or perhaps you won't marry at all, will become one of those maiden aunts who live on family charity and are discussed in pity and whispers. Your husband reads the same item and shakes his head. Poor family, he says, and you realise with a jolt that his sympathy is entirely for the parents, not for Catherine herself. In his framework, Catherine has failed at a fundamental requirement, like a racehorse that refuses to race or a hunting dog that runs from birds. The fact that she might have been fighting against her own nature, that she might have suffered years of training and correction, that the failure might represent nothing more than her authentic self breaking through forced performance. None of this occurs to him. You want to explain, want to make him understand, but the words stick in your throat. Explaining would require revealing yourself, and you're not ready for that, may never be ready for that. Historians still argue about how common these scandals actually were versus how much the threat of scandal was used to enforce compliance. Society pages document the most dramatic cases: young women withdrawn from society, engagements broken, families ruined, but these may have been exceptional rather than typical. For every Catherine Thornbury whose mistake became public scandal, how many women made smaller errors that were quietly overlooked or deliberately ignored? How many men noticed left-handed lapses but chose not to mention them, either from kindness or from their own disinterest in the elaborate rules? The historical record preserves the disasters but obscures the everyday compromises and acts of mercy that may have been far more common. You remember your own close calls, moments when your control slipped and disaster loomed. At your wedding breakfast, just exhausted and overwhelmed, you reached for your champagne glass with your left hand. Your mother saw it. You caught her sharp intake of breath, saw her eyes widen. But before anyone else noticed, she created a small distraction, knocking over a water glass so everyone's attention shifted to her. In the confusion, you switched hands, and the moment passed. Your mother never mentioned it, never acknowledged what she'd done. But you knew, and she knew, and the unspoken understanding hung between you. She'd saved you because she understood what was at stake, understood it better than anyone because she'd lived through it herself. Do you remember wondering in that moment if your mother was also left-handed, if the asymmetry you carried was inherited not just genetically but experientially, passed from mother to daughter as trauma rather than trait? The specific incident that destroyed Catherine Thornbury's season apparently involved multiple errors over the course of an evening. According to the whispers that reach you through your network of ladies who take tea together, Catherine used her left hand 3 separate times, once to adjust her hair, once to accept a glass of lemonade, and finally, catastrophically, to gesture with her fan while speaking to the Earl of Pemberton's eldest son. The first 2 errors might have been overlooked, dismissed as momentary fatigue, but the fan gesture, executed with her left hand in full view of the ballroom's most eligible bachelor, crossed a line. The young man made his excuses and walked away. Lady Westmore mentioned it to the Duchess of Ashford. By the next morning, Catherine's name was being discussed in a dozen drawing rooms. By the afternoon, her mother had withdrawn her from society. The speed of it, the casual destruction of a young woman's future based on which hand she used for an accessory, the injustice makes you physically ill. Your friend Margaret writes from Edinburgh, having heard about the Thornbury scandal even at that distance. I think of her often, Margaret writes. This girl I've never met who had the misfortune of being too visibly herself. I think about how easily it could have been me, or you, or any of us who weren't quite successfully erased by our training. And I wonder whether she feels relief underneath the disaster relief that the performance is over. that she no longer has to maintain the exhausting pretense. Is it terrible that part of me envies her? She's free now, in a way, ruined, but free. You read the letter 3 times, trying to decide if Margaret is right. Would there be relief in exposure? Would the end of vigilance be worth the social death that accompanied it? You can't decide. The question feels too large, too frightening. The economics of these scandals reveal the stakes involved. For upper-class families like the Thornburys, a daughter's successful marriage represents an investment return connections formed, properties consolidated, bloodlines merged. A scandal doesn't just affect the individual girl, it damages the entire family's standing, potentially impacting younger siblings' prospects, business relationships, social access. The pressure on young women to perform perfectly wasn't just about individual propriety, but about family economics and dynastic ambition. Catherine Thornbury's left-handedness, revealed at the wrong moment, became a financial disaster as much as a social one. Her family has likely spent thousands of pounds preparing for this season wardrobes, parties, music lessons, dancing masters, all the accumulated expenses of launching a daughter into society, and those pounds are now wasted, the investment producing no return. You find yourself obsessing over Catherine's story, wondering about the details the society pages don't report. Was she left-handed from birth? Did her family know? What training did she receive? Did she resist or comply? What finally broke her will? Her strength, her ability to maintain the constant vigilance. Was the ballroom error truly an accident? Or was it, on some level, deliberate? A conscious or unconscious decision to stop performing, to let the real self show through? Consequences be damned, you'll never know. You'll probably never even meet Catherine Thornbury. But her story haunts you because it so easily could have been yours. Because you recognise in her disaster the shape of a fate you've spent 20 years desperately avoiding. Your husband mentions, almost casually, that the Thornbury father is ruined financially. He'd apparently borrowed heavily to fund Catherine's debut season, confident that she'd make a brilliant match that would restore the family's declining fortunes. Now he faces debts he cannot pay, social disgrace, and a daughter he cannot marry off. The combination might force him to sell the family estate, might reduce them to genteel poverty or worse. And all because a girl used her left hand. The absurdity and tragedy of it strike you simultaneously. Lives destroyed, fortunes lost, a family's multi-generational legacy erased because of handedness, because of an arbitrary rule that has nothing to do with moral character or human worth, because society decided, at some point in history, that left hands were wrong and right hands were correct, and then built elaborate structures to enforce that decision, structures so powerful they could crush anyone who failed to comply. The Thornbury scandal ripples through society for weeks, becoming a cautionary tale mothers used to frighten their daughters into compliance. Remember what happened to the Thornbury girl, they say, and young women redouble their vigilance, practice their right-handed movements with renewed desperation, check and recheck which hand they're using for every gesture. The scandal serves its purpose not just punishing Catherine, but using her destruction to enforce conformity among everyone else. You're complicit in this, you realise with shame, by successfully hiding your own left-handedness, by performing right-handedness so convincingly that no one suspects. You're helping maintain the system that just destroyed Catherine Thornbury. Your successful passing validates the rules that demand passing. Your invisible suffering enables the visible suffering of women who can't or won't hide as effectively. The guilt of this sits heavy in your chest, indigestible, a moral indigestion you can't resolve because resolving it would require exposing yourself, becoming the next cautionary tale. And you're not brave enough for that. You're not sure anyone is. You're standing in the servants' corridor outside the kitchen, hidden where the family never ventures, and you're watching something extraordinary unfold. The cook, Mrs. Davies, is kneading bread dough with powerful, rhythmic movements using both hands equally, alternating left and right with complete unself-consciousness. Your lady's maid Sarah stands beside you, and she whispers, "Below stairs, no one cares which hand you use. Too much work to be precious about it." You watch as the scullery maid peels potatoes left-handed, as the footman polishes silver with his left hand, while his right hand holds the piece steady. The servant's world operates under different rules, or perhaps under no particular handedness rules at all, and the casual freedom of it makes your chest ache with something that feels like grief mixed with wonder. The servant's perspective on handedness reveals class dimensions of the prejudice that you've never fully considered. Below stairs, efficiency matters more than etiquette. A left-handed maid who can clean rooms faster, or a left-handed footman who can carry heavier loads is valued for competence, not judged for handedness. The elaborate fan language that governs your life is irrelevant in spaces where fans are luxury items rarely used. The constant performance that exhausts you would be seen as absurd affectation in the working-class world, where hands are tools for labour, not symbols of breeding and moral character. Sarah has confirmed what you suspected. She's known about your left-handedness since she began working for you 3 years ago. Recognized it in the asymmetry of your body, the way you sometimes start to reach with your left hand before catching yourself. Mrs. Davies notices you watching and pauses in her kneading. For a moment, you're mortified the mistress has been caught lurking in servant spaces, observing their work like some kind of spy. But Mrs. Davies simply wipes flour from her hands and says, matter-of-factly, "My youngest daughter is left-handed. Ma'am, I never tried to train it out of her." Seemed cruel. And what's the point? She'll be in service herself soon enough, and no one will care which hand she uses to scrub floors or wash dishes. The casual acceptance in her voice, the complete absence of moral judgment, makes you want to weep. Her daughter will grow up without the training that defined your childhood, will enter adulthood able to use her natural hand, will never develop the asymmetry and chronic pain that plague you, because she's working class, because her hands matter only for their utility, not their symbolism. Historians still argue about whether working class tolerance of left-handedness was genuinely greater than upper class intolerance, or whether the historical record simply preserves more evidence of upper class concerns. Certainly some working class parents did train left-handedness out of their children, either mimicking upper class norms or following their own traditions. But the economic pressures were different. A working class family couldn't afford to have a child spend hours daily practicing right-handed movements when that child needed to contribute to household labour. The training that consumed your childhood 2, 3, 4 hours daily of focus correction was a luxury only available to families wealthy enough to have governesses and spare time. The cruelty you endured was, in a sense, a marker of privilege, suffering that only the upper classes could afford to inflict. Sarah leads you to the servants' sitting room, where off-duty staff gather during their few hours of leisure. A young footman sits writing a letter left-handed, his script flowing easily across the page. The housekeeper does needlework with ambidextrous ease, her hands moving in complex coordination that would be impossible if one had been deliberately weakened. You watch these people perform ordinary tasks with both hands, using whichever is most convenient for the job at hand, and you realise you're witnessing something you've never seen in your own social class, people inhabiting their bodies naturally, without constant self-monitoring, without the performance that defines every moment of your existence. The envy you feel is so intense it's almost painful. The coaching that your mother and Miss Hartley provided, the endless corrections and punishments, are mirrored now in what you observe between the upper servants and lower ones. The butler is training a new footman in proper table service, and you hear him say, "Right hand for serving, left hand for clearing, always. The family expects it." So even here, in servant spaces, some handedness rules persist not from moral conviction but from the need to maintain standards the employee family expects. The footman practices the movements, but his training is measured in days, not years. He's learning a professional skill, not having his fundamental nature suppressed. When his shift ends, he'll revert to using whichever hand is natural. You never get to revert. Your shift never ends, Mrs. Davies brings you tea. She's crossed some social boundary by inviting you to sit in the servants' hall, but no one seems troubled by it. Perhaps your obvious distress has earned you temporary asylum in their world. "I've watched you these past years, ma'am." "Mrs.," Davies says quietly, "seen how you hold yourself, that tension that never leaves. My sister was like you, gentry family, married into minor nobility, left-handed but trained out of it. She developed terrible headaches, shaking in her hands, couldn't sleep proper. The doctor called it hysteria." "Mrs.," Davies pauses, adding sugar to her own tea left-handed. "But I knew it was simpler than that. She was exhausted from pretending every moment of every day. The pretending killed her, in the end. Or maybe it was the laudanum she took for the headaches. Same thing, really." The story chills you because you recognize yourself in it. The headaches, the trembling, the exhaustion, the increasing reliance on tonics and medicines that blur the edges of consciousness enough to make the constant performance bearable. You're on a trajectory toward destruction. You realize, wearing your body down through decades of unnatural use, and the medical establishment will never recognize the true cause because acknowledging it would require questioning the entire social structure built on arbitrary handedness rules. You'll be diagnosed with hysteria, with feminine weakness, with moral failing. You'll be prescribed rest and tonics and avoidance of intellectual stimulation. And you'll continue to deteriorate because the actual problem that you're living in a body you've been taught to mistrust and misuse will remain unaddressed. Sarah sits beside you, her presence somehow comforting. "There's a woman in Southwark," she says carefully, "who takes in ladies who've been ruined by various things. Not a workhouse, more like a private arrangement. Some of the women there are left-handed, living openly as such. They do piecework, sewing and such. Use whichever hand they like. They're poor, mind you, and they're considered fallen women by society. But they're also free in ways ladies of quality can never be." She watches your face as she speaks, gauging your reaction. You understand what she's offering information about: an escape route, a way out if you ever become desperate enough. The fact that this escape route involves poverty and social death tells you everything about your options. You think about Catherine Thornbury. Wonder if she's heard about this place in Southwark. Wonder if she'll end up there eventually when her family's money runs out and her status as a genteel maiden aunt becomes unsustainable. Perhaps that's the trajectory for visibly left-handed women of your class, a slow descent through layers of society until they land somewhere that finally allows them to exist as themselves. The price is everything. They were born with: status, comfort, respectability, family connections. But they gain something to authenticity, the ability to inhabit their own bodies without constant vigilance. Is it worth it? You can't answer. The question is too large, too frightening. The afternoon light slants through the high windows of the servants' hall, and you realise you've been below stairs for nearly 2 hours. Your husband will wonder where you've gone. You stand, smoothing your dress, preparing to return to your proper role, Mrs. Davies stands too, and impulsively. You reach out with your left hand to shake hers. She takes it without hesitation, her grip firm and warm. "You're always welcome here, ma'am," she says. Sometimes a person needs to be somewhere they don't have to pretend. No, Sarah escorts you back upstairs, through the hidden corridors that connect the servants' world to yours, and at the boundary, the green baize door that separates the two realms, you pause. Once you step through, you'll resume the performance. Pick up the burden of constant self-monitoring. Become again the right-handed lady everyone believes you to be. The door feels like a portal between different versions of reality, different rules about what bodies can do and be. You step through, the door closes behind you. You're back in the world where handedness matters, where fans must be held just so, where your left hand is a shameful secret that must never be revealed. But something has shifted. You've seen proof that other worlds exist, that the rules governing your life aren't universal or inevitable, that somewhere, even if that somewhere is just a servant's hall or a house in Southwark, women like you can exist without constant performance. The knowledge doesn't free you. You're still trapped by your class, your marriage, your internalized surveillance. But it plants a seed of possibility that wasn't there before, a small rebellious thought that perhaps, eventually, in some future you can barely imagine, things might be different, not for you probably, but for someone, someday. The thought has to be enough because it's all you have. You're 35 years old now, and you're reading in the newspaper about a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who has somehow managed to become a physician despite every obstacle Victorian society could place in her path. And the article mentions, almost in passing, that she advocates for ending the practice of forcing left-handed children to use their right hands. The article treats this position as eccentric, one of several radical views held by this unusual woman, but you read the paragraph 5 times, your hand shaking so badly the newspaper rattles, someone with authority, with credentials, with a voice that reaches beyond drawing rooms and into public discourse, is saying that what was done to you was wrong. The validation is so powerful and so painful that you have to set down the paper and simply breathe for several minutes. The resistance to handedness correction emerged slowly throughout the late Victorian period, championed primarily by a small group of medical reformers, educators, and social progressives who questioned traditional practices. Dr. Garrett Anderson wasn't alone. Other physicians were beginning to document the psychological and physical harm caused by forced handedness training. They published studies showing increased rates of stuttering among corrected left-handers, documented cases of nervous disorders and anxiety that they tentatively linked to the suppression of natural dominance. They argued, cautiously at first and then more boldly, that handedness was a biological variation like eye colour or height, not a moral failing requiring correction. But these voices remained marginal throughout the 1870s and 1880s, their ideas dismissed by the medical mainstream as dangerous permissiveness that would undermine social order. You show the article to your husband, watching his face carefully as he reads. His expression moves through confusion, skepticism, and finally dismissal. "Radical nonsense," he says, handing the paper back. "Next they'll be arguing we should let children do whatever they please. Abandon all standards of proper behaviour." He doesn't understand that he's talking about you, that the children who suffered forced training include the woman sitting across from him. You've never told him about your left-handedness, and in this moment, you realise you never will. The gulf between his understanding and your experience is too vast to bridge. He lives in a world where the rules make sense, where proper training produces proper ladies, where the system works because look at you perfectly right-handed. properly trained, a success story. He cannot see the cost because you've hidden it so effectively. Historians still argue about what factors contributed to the gradual decline of handedness correction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Was it the growing influence of medical reformers? The broader social changes that accompanied industrialization and urbanization? The influence of educational theorists who emphasized natural child development? Or simply generational change as younger parents, remembering their own suffering, chose not to inflict the same training on their children? The shift happened slowly, unevenly, with some families abandoning correction while others maintained it well into the 20th century. But by the 1890s, one could find published articles questioning the practice, schools experimenting with allowing left-handed writing, parents tentatively deciding not to correct their children's handedness. You're too old to benefit from these changes yourself, but you think constantly about whether you would have been different if you'd been born 20 years later. Would you be more confident, more comfortable in your body, less exhausted by constant performance? Or would the training have found other outlets, other aspects of your natural self to suppress? The Victorian lady required constant moulding and correction in so many areas: posture, speech, emotional expression, intellectual curiosity, physical movement. Handedness was just one element in a comprehensive system designed to transform girls into acceptable women. Even if you'd been allowed your left hand, you would still have faced corsets that restricted breathing, rules about proper topics of conversation, prohibitions against running or raising your voice, the endless regulations that governed every aspect of feminine existence. Margaret writes from Edinburgh with extraordinary news she's joined a women's suffrage group, and at their meetings, she uses her left hand openly. No one cares. The women there are too focused on demanding the vote, on challenging the legal structures that define them as property, to worry about which hand someone uses to hold a teacup. It's liberating and terrifying, Margaret writes. I'm 40 years old, and I'm learning what it feels like to exist without constant self-monitoring. My left hand is stronger than I remembered, but also weaker than it should be. The muscles atrophied during all those years of forced disuse. I'm essentially teaching myself to be left-handed again, reclaiming something that was stolen from me as a child. Some of the younger women at the meetings don't understand why this matters so much to me. They've never been corrected, never endured the training. They use whichever hand they please without thinking about it. Seeing them is like glimpsing a future I'll never inhabit. You consider Margaret's path joining reformist groups, living openly as left-handed in progressive circles, aligning herself with suffragettes and radicals. Could you do the same? The question feels almost absurd. You're married to a conventional man, embedded in conventional society, dependent on maintaining conventional appearances. You have no independent income, no education that would allow you to support yourself, no experience of the world beyond the narrow parameters of respectable femininity. Margaret has advantages. You lack a sympathetic husband, a university town's intellectual culture, a personality more naturally rebellious than yours. You've spent 35 years learning to be invisible, to suppress inconvenient aspects of yourself, to perform whatever version of femininity the moment requires. You're not sure you're capable of being openly, defiantly yourself. The performance has become so complete that you're not certain what yourself would even look like. The younger generation puzzles and disturbs you in equal measure. You meet your friend's daughter at a tea party, a girl of 16 who attends one of the new progressive schools. She picks up her teacup with her left hand unselfconsciously, and when you can't help staring, she notices and smiles. I'm left-handed, she says, as though this were a neutral fact like having brown hair or being tall. My school allows it. They say forcing children to use their non-dominant hand can cause psychological damage. She says this casually, having no idea what she's describing, no understanding that she's speaking to someone who embodies that very damage. You manage to smile and nod, but inside, you're screaming. This girl has what you were denied the simple right to exist as herself, and she doesn't even recognize it as a privilege because for her, it's just normal. The rebels who defied handedness rules during the Victorian era rarely left records of their resistance because their resistance succeeded or failed privately, in individual lives that didn't make historical footnotes. But you hear stories, sometimes whispers, about a woman in York who learned to write beautifully with both hands so no one could tell which was natural, about a girl in Cornwall who deliberately broke her right arm so she'd be forced to use her left during the healing period, and then claimed the left had become dominant through necessity. Acts of resistance disguised as accidents or accommodations. Small rebellions that flew under the radar of formal social surveillance. You wonder if you could have been one of these rebels, if you'd been braver or more desperate or simply different, but you chose survival through compliance, and that choice has defined your entire life. You're sitting in your drawing room, ostensibly doing needlework but actually just holding the needle in your trembling right hand. When your niece visits, she's 12, bright-eyed, chattering about her lessons. At one point, she picks up a book from your table with her left hand and you freeze. Your sister-in-law notices your reaction and laughs. Oh, we decided not to correct her handedness. The new theories suggest it's harmless, and the training seemed unnecessarily cruel. She manages perfectly well. Your niece, oblivious to the significance of this conversation, flips through the book left-handed while describing a history lesson about the Romans. You watch her casual left-handed competence with emotions you can't untangle: joy that she's been spared what you endured, rage that the correction you suffered is now considered unnecessarily cruel, as though your suffering was always optional, grief for the lost version of yourself who might have been as unself-conscious and confident as this 12-year-old girl. The world is changing without you. The next generation will grow up in a society where left-handedness carries less stigma, where correction is less automatic, where some children, not all, but some will be allowed to develop naturally. This progress is real and important, but it doesn't help you. You're still trapped in your trained right-handedness, still performing constantly, still carrying the physical and psychological scars of Victorian handedness ideology. The reforms came too late for you, as reforms so often do, helping the next generation while leaving the current one to suffer through systems everyone now agrees were harmful. Your niece will never fully understand what you endured because she'll never have to endure it herself. The erasure of your suffering through progress is both the point and a particular cruelty, making your pain retroactively unnecessary, revealing that you were sacrificed to social rules that weren't even important enough to maintain. You're 52 years old, and you're standing in your daughter's nursery watching a young woman named Miss Fletcher teach your granddaughter her letters. The child is 5, bright and curious, and she keeps reaching for the pencil with her left hand. Miss Fletcher gently redirects her to use her right hand, but without the ruler, without the harsh corrections, without the binding and the punishments. Is correction, yes, but softened, apologetic almost. Miss Fletcher catches your eye and says, "The family requested she be trained right-handed. Ma'am, the old-fashioned way. I've explained that modern pedagogy suggests otherwise, but," she trails off, "and you understand. Your son-in-law is conventional. Your daughter was trained right-handed herself and sees no reason to do differently, and this little girl will undergo a gentler version of what you endured." But she'll still be trained out of her natural inclination because some families resist change, even when change becomes mainstream. The slow decline of handedness correction throughout the Edwardian era and into the early 20th century happened unevenly, creating a patchwork of practices that varied by family, region, and social class. By 1900, many progressive families had abandoned correction entirely, influenced by new psychological theories and educational reforms. But conservative families, especially in rural areas or among the traditional aristocracy, maintained the old practices. Some families split the difference, allowing left-handed eating and general tasks but requiring right-handed writing and formal social behaviours. The result was a generation of children receiving wildly inconsistent messages about whether their left-handedness was acceptable, shameful, or somewhere in between. The confusion in some ways was worse than the old certainty, leaving children unsure what was expected and parents anxious about making the wrong choice. You want to intervene, want to tell Miss Fletcher to let the child use her left hand, want to explain to your daughter that the training isn't necessary, that it causes harm, that this little girl should be spared what you endured. But what authority do you have? You're the success story, the perfectly trained right-handed lady whose life apparently proves the system works. If you reveal your own left-handedness now, after 50 years of hiding it, you'd have to explain why you never mentioned it before, why you maintained the deception through courtship and marriage and child-rearing. The revelation would raise too many questions, create too much disruption, so you remain silent, complicit in your granddaughter's correction, watching history repeat itself in a gentler but still harmful form. Historians still argue about when exactly handedness correction ended as a mainstream practice. Some date it to the 1920s, when psychological research on handedness became more sophisticated and educational reforms spread more widely. Others argue it persisted much longer in pockets of conservative society, with some families practicing correction into the 1950s or even 1960s. And of course, the practice never ended completely even today. Some cultures and some families continue to train left-handed children into right-handedness, though the justifications have shifted from moral and religious arguments to pragmatic concerns about living in a right-handed world. The prejudice adapted rather than disappeared, finding new rationales to justify old practices. You spend more time with your granddaughter than is perhaps typical for a woman of your station, in part because you're watching for signs of damage, ready to intervene if the correction becomes too harsh. You see the child's confusion when Miss Fletcher redirects her hand. See the moment of hesitation before she reaches for objects. See her checking which hand she's using before committing to a movement. The early stages of self-monitoring, the beginning of the performance that will define her life if the training continues. You want to tell her it's not her fault, that there's nothing wrong with her left hand, that she's being corrected for something that isn't actually incorrect. But you don't. You smile and praise her when she uses her right hand correctly, reinforcing the very system you know is harmful, because what else can you do? You're too old, too tired, too deeply embedded in the structures you've spent a lifetime navigating to become a rebel now. Your daughter visits one afternoon, and you try cautiously to discuss handedness training. I've been reading that some modern educators think forcing handedness correction may cause more harm than good, you say carefully, showing her an article from a progressive women's magazine. Your daughter glances at it and shrugs. Perhaps for working-class children who'll never need refined social skills. But Elizabeth will be a lady of society. She needs to learn proper behaviours. I turned out perfectly well, didn't I? You look at your daughter confident, conventional, perfectly right-handed, and realise she has no idea what the training cost you because you've hidden it so successfully. Your sacrifice was so complete that it's invisible even to your own child. The futility of it strikes you like a physical blow. The changes you've witnessed over your lifetime are real but incomplete. Left-handedness is less stigmatized than it was in your childhood, but stigma remains. Children are corrected less harshly, but many are still corrected. The theological justifications have faded, but practical arguments have replaced them. Left-handers will struggle in a right-handed world. Better to train them young. The oppression has modernized, rationalized itself, found new vocabularies to justify old prejudices. You wonder if this is how all social change works, slow, grudging, incomplete, leaving those who suffered under the old system without vindication or compensation, offering only the cold comfort that future generations might suffer less. You've developed arthritis in both hands now, but the right is far worse. The joints swollen and painful from decades of overuse. Your doctor, a young man who trained at Edinburgh, more progressive than old doctor, Pemberton examines your hands and asks directly, if you were forced into right-handedness as a child, the question shocks you. No one has ever asked before. You hesitate, then nod. He sighs. I see this frequently in women your age. The forced training causes lasting damage, repetitive strain injuries, premature arthritis, chronic pain. There's not much I can do now except manage the symptoms. I'm sorry. His apology, genuine and kind, breaks something in you. You cry in his office. Decades of suppressed grief finally finding an outlet, and he sits quietly until you compose yourself. The practice was barbaric, he says. I'm glad we're moving past it, though not quickly enough for those who suffered under it. The younger generation's casual acceptance of left-handedness feels like watching a door slowly open, revealing a room you'll never be allowed to enter. Your granddaughter will likely grow up in a world where handedness matters less, where correction is rarer, where using your natural hand isn't a shameful secret. But that world is being built on the suffering of women like you, women who endured correction and carried its scars so that eventually, someday, the practice might be recognized as harmful and abandoned. You're the necessary sacrifice. The generation that suffered so the next generation wouldn't have to. There's supposed to be nobility in that, meaning in your suffering. But mostly you just feel tired, cheated, angry that you never got to be yourself, that you spent your entire life performing a version of femininity that required suppressing your fundamental nature. Margaret writes less frequently now she's in her 60s. Her husband has died, and she lives alone in Edinburgh, still involved in suffrage work, still living openly as left-handed in her private life. I've reclaimed what I could, she writes in her last letter, but so much was lost permanently. My left hand is functional but weak, decades of disuse having atrophied muscles that never fully recovered. More than that, I've lost time all those years I could have been comfortable in my own body, wasted in performance and pretense. We deserve better. The girls coming up now deserve better. I hope they get it, but I'll never know if they do. I'm too tired to keep fighting. You understand her exhaustion. You feel it yourself, bone deep, the weariness of a lifetime spent in opposition to your own nature. You're teaching your granddaughter a rhyme one afternoon, this little piggy went to market, and you use her left hand without thinking. The child giggles, wiggling her toes, and for a moment you forget the rules, forget the constant monitoring, forget everything except the simple joy of playing with a child. Your daughter walks in and freezes. Mother, you're using her left hand, please use the right. The reprimand is gentle but firm. You switch hands, and your granddaughter's expression shifts, becoming guarded, confused. She's learning that some parts of herself are acceptable, and others must be hidden, learning to perform. learning to split herself into public and private selves. You watch it happening and feel complicit, guilty, helpless. The cycle continues. The damage perpetuates itself. And you don't know how to stop it because you never learned how to stop it in yourself. Never found the courage or the circumstances that would have allowed you to simply exist as you are. The performance goes on, generation after generation, each one hopefully a little less harsh, a little less damaged, slowly grinding toward a future where maybe, finally, handedness won't matter at all. You're 68 years old, sitting in your garden on a warm spring afternoon, and your right hand has become so crippled with arthritis that you can barely hold a teacup. Your left hand, comparatively undamaged, has slowly been taking over daily tasks out of necessity rather than choice. After 6 decades of suppression, your natural dominance is reasserting itself. And the irony isn't lost on you. Your body is finally being allowed to function naturally only because your trained hand has broken down completely. Your daughter notices, of course. Notices that you're eating left-handed now, writing left-handed, gesturing left-handed. She doesn't comment. Perhaps she understands, finally. Or perhaps she simply decided that at your age, propriety matters less than function. Either way, you're experiencing something you never thought you know, the freedom to use your left hand in front of others without fear or shame. The legacy of Victorian handedness training extends far beyond the immediate physical and psychological damage to individuals. It shaped an entire generation's understanding of the body, of self-discipline, of the relationship between natural instinct and social requirement. Women your age carry particular scars, not just the physical asymmetry and chronic pain, but the psychological patterns of constant self-monitoring, of viewing your own body as something to be controlled and corrected rather than inhabited and trusted. These patterns don't disappear even when the specific rules that created them have been abandoned. You still sometimes catch yourself reaching for something with your right hand, still experience a flicker of anxiety when you use your left hand in public, still carry the internalized observer who judges every movement. The training was so thorough that it rewired not just your physical habits, but your fundamental sense of self. Your granddaughter is 15 now, and she writes naturally with her left hand despite all the early correction attempts. At some point, you're not sure exactly when your son-in-law gave up on the training, influenced perhaps by Elizabeth's school, which explicitly permitted left-handed writing, or by the broader cultural shift that made handedness correction seem old-fashioned and unnecessarily cruel. Elizabeth has grown up left-handed, comfortable in her body in ways you never were, and watching her is bittersweet. She represents the future you dreamed of but never experienced, the possibility that was denied to you but granted to her. She has no idea how fortunate she is, no concept of what life would have been like if she'd been born 50 years earlier. The erasure of that history, the fact that her comfort was purchased with your suffering, but she'll never know. It feels like the final indignity. Historians now generally agree that forced handedness training was harmful, counterproductive, and based on prejudices rather than legitimate concerns. Modern neurological research has confirmed what some Victorian reformers suspected. Handedness is determined by brain organisation. Suppressing it causes genuine damage, and there's no moral or practical reason to force left-handed children to use their right hands. The vindication comes too late for you, of course. Your suffering has been retrospectively recognised as unnecessary, your lifelong struggle acknowledged as having been for nothing. But that acknowledgement doesn't restore your natural hand's lost strength, doesn't repair the neurological pathways that were forcibly redirected, doesn't give you back the decades you spent in constant performance. It simply confirms that you were sacrificed to rules that shouldn't have existed. You've been writing your memoirs awkwardly, painfully, with your left hand because your right can no longer manage a pen. The writing is therapeutic in ways you didn't expect, finally, after a lifetime of silence. You're documenting what happened to you, naming the harm, refusing to let it remain invisible. You write about Miss Hartley's ruler, about your mother's complicity, about the years of pain and correction, about the performance that consumed your life, about watching your granddaughter undergo a milder version of the same training. You write about the servants' hall where left-handedness was casually accepted, about the Chinese tea house where you saw a different possibility, about Margaret's courage in reclaiming her natural hand in middle age. You write about Catherine Thornbury, wondering whatever happened to her, hoping she found some peace after her public disaster. You don't know if anyone will read these memoirs, if anyone will care, but writing them feels necessary, a way of insisting that your experience mattered even though it changed nothing. Your husband died 2 years ago, and in his final months, confused by illness, he asked why you suddenly seemed to be using your left hand for everything. You told him the truth that you'd always been left-handed, that you'd hidden it throughout your marriage, that the woman he'd lived with for 40 years had been performing a version of herself rather than being herself. He didn't understand. He thought the illness was making you say strange things. He died believing you were right-handed, never knowing the truth about the woman he'd married. The fact that you maintained the deception even on his deathbed, even when honesty was finally safe, reveals something about how deeply the performance had become embedded in your identity. You weren't just pretending to be right-handed for others, you'd almost convinced yourself, had split your identity so thoroughly that the left-handed you seemed like a different person, a secret self who emerged only in private moments. The prejudices you absorbed in childhood have proven remarkably persistent despite your intellectual understanding that they're baseless. Even now, using your left hand by necessity rather than choice, you sometimes feel that old shame, that sense of doing something wrong or dirty. The training went so deep that rational understanding can't fully dislodge it. You know left-handedness is morally neutral. Know the theological arguments were nonsense. Know you are harmed for no good reason. But knowing doesn't erase the feelings, doesn't silence the internalized voice that still whispers wrong, wrong, wrong when your left hand reaches for something. The damage is permanent. You'll die carrying these scars, this distorted relationship with your own body, these patterns of self-judgment that were carved into you before you were old enough to resist or understand. You're sitting with Elizabeth in your garden, watching her sketch left-handed, her movements fluid and unself-conscious. She's drawn to art, wants to study at the Slade School, has dreams that would have been impossible for a woman of your generation. You want to tell her how lucky she is. Want to explain what it means that she can simply exist as left-handed without fear or shame. Want her to understand the struggle that preceded her freedom. But you don't. What would be the point? She can't change the past, can't retroactively save you from what you endured. And burdening her with knowledge of historical suffering seems cruel when she's sitting here, happy and comfortable, embodying the future you dreamed of but never experienced. So you simply watch her draw, feeling the complex mixture of joy and grief that has characterized your entire relationship with younger, left-handed women. Joy that they're free. Grief that you never were. The world has changed in remarkable ways during your lifetime. Women are demanding the vote, attending universities, entering professions that were closed to your generation. Your granddaughter will grow up in a century where women have opportunities you couldn't have imagined. But some changes came too slowly. The handedness reform that could have saved you happened a generation late. leaving you to suffer under rules that were already being questioned but not yet abandoned. You're part of that unlucky cohort caught between the old world and the new, too young to accept the old ways as inevitable but too old to benefit from the reforms. Your suffering was transitional, necessary perhaps for social change, but offering no consolation to those who endured it. Margaret died last year, and her daughter wrote to you afterward, mentioning that her mother had left instructions for her left hand to be placed over her heart in the coffin, a small act of defiance even in death, a refusal to let her natural hand be hidden any longer. You've made a similar request in your own will, though you're not sure why it matters. Who will see you in the coffin besides the undertaker, but it matters somehow. This final assertion of your true nature. This refusal to perform even when performance no longer serves any purpose. Let them see, you think. Let them know that the perfect right-handed lady they thought they knew was always someone else underneath, always performing, always hiding, always struggling against herself to meet their arbitrary standards. You close your eyes, feeling the sun warm on your face, listening to the scratch of Elizabeth's pencil on paper. Your left hand rests in your lap, finally at ease after decades of tension. The pain in your arthritic right hand is constant but familiar, a reminder of the price you paid for social acceptance, for a good marriage, for the respectable life you've lived. Was it worth it? The question has no answer. You survived. You made the choices that seemed necessary at the time. You protected yourself in the only ways available to you. But survival isn't the same as living, and protection isn't the same as freedom. You've spent 68 years as a carefully constructed performance, and now, near the end, you're finally glimpsing what it might have felt like to simply be yourself. The glimpse is beautiful and heartbreaking. A door opening onto a room you'll barely have time to explore before your time runs out. But Elizabeth is in that room already, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps your suffering, meaningless and unnecessary as it was for you personally, created the possibility for her to live differently. Perhaps the accumulated weight of women like you, women who endured correction and carried its scars, eventually became heavy enough to break the system that created you. Perhaps your silence, your compliance, your successful performance was paradoxically necessary for the reforms that now allow younger women to refuse that same performance. The thought provides a small measure of comfort, though it doesn't erase the grief for your lost life, for the person you might have been if Victorian society had allowed you to exist as yourself, rather than requiring you to transform into someone acceptable. You lived. You survived. You performed perfectly. And in performing perfectly, you disappeared. This is your legacy, your triumph, your tragedy. And it's almost over now. The afternoon light softens, shadows lengthening across the garden. Elizabeth chatters about her plans, her dreams, her future. You listen with your eyes closed, memorising her voice. This moment, this glimpse of the world you helped create but will never fully inhabit. Your left hand, finally free, rests peacefully in the warm sunlight. After a lifetime of hiding, it exists openly, naturally, without shame. The performance is ending. The real you, so long suppressed, emerges tentatively into the light. And it's enough. Barely. To have this small moment of authenticity before the story ends. It's not redemption, it's not justice, but it's something. And after 68 years of nothing, something feels like grace,